always look up.
Okay.
There we go. Maybe we would have extra time.
So the meeting is open. Members, welcome to the 13th meeting of the Committee for Finance in this 22 to 27 mandate. Members, this committee meeting will be recorded and broadcast throughout Parliament buildings and online. Those in the public gallery, should there be any, are welcome to use mobile devices as long as they are in airplane mode or in silent. So people can connect to Assembly Wi-Fi as normal. We do have apologies from Deirdre Hargett. It's worth.
And we're aware Chair Philip Brett is going to be late. His other committee is still running. So
Philip has informed us he's going to be slightly late, about 1:30. But he obviously is chair of an economy committee. I would just put on the record that obviously Deirdre has temporarily stepped in to be economy minister while her colleague Conor Murphy hopefully just deals with a health issue over the next short period. So just to put on the record, I wish Conor Murphy all the best, and indeed and all the best to our committee colleague Deirdre while she takes up that post. She does remain a member of the committee and obviously will be returning at some point in the very near future. So we'll give her all the best.
We also have Nicola Brogan and Jerry Carroll on Zoom.
So we have two members who've joined us remotely, Nicola Carroll and Nicola Carroll. Get myself confused.
Three members.
I know you married all, but we haven't quite Nicola Brogan and Jerry Carroll. So obviously, guys, should you wish to come in, and I'm sure you will, on the evidence sessions, just put your hand up and make yourself known. Next item is declaration of interest. So members, you're obliged to declare any relevant financial or other interests at each committee meeting as applicable. Have members any relevant interests they wish to declare at this point? No. Obviously you can declare through the meeting at some point should you need to. Item 3 is chairperson's business. There's one item of chairperson's business which I want to raise, which is around the Finance Minister's engagement with UK finance and the banks. So I would draw people's attention to the fact that I believe it was yesterday, whenever we had the debate on the order relating to the ATM rates relief for rural ATMs, the Minister helpfully, in a sense, told us that she had been engaging with financial services, UK Finance, which is the trade body, and banks, and also I think Link, which is the ATM. I don't know if it was a business or not, or a system. Yeah. So that was useful information that she gave us, but I think it prompted me to think that it would be appropriate for the committee to write to the Minister, to the department, to ask for an update specifically on that meeting and what was discussed, but also any action points or outcomes that came from that meeting, given that we as a committee have agreed that we agreed at our strategic session that one of our priorities will be to look at financial services and provision of banking services in Northern Ireland. This is obviously in the context of this being a reserved matter, but clearly there is a huge devolved interest both for the finance and economy departments and indeed for the Assembly. And I think there's a broad degree of consensus that specific issues to do with financial services in Northern Ireland are not always raised or front of mind either at the Treasury or in Westminster. So if people are content, we will write to the Minister and the Department to ask for a specific update on what was discussed at the meeting they had with financial services bodies, whether there were any agreed actions or outputs that are relevant to our work. If people are content with that, Steve Aiken would like to come in.
Yes, thanks very much indeed, Chair. I think this is to be welcomed. Just in our letter, could we actually ask then if the Finance Minister is taking the lead, therefore, on their interrelationships with UK Finance? Because previous Finance Ministers have indicated it was a matter for the Department of Economy, and we've had members of the Department of Economy saying it was matters that nobody ever took a lead. Could we just ascertain whether the Finance Minister is taking the lead in this? And if that is the case, I think that's to be welcomed.
I think that's a reasonable thing to put in the letter. Yeah.
Yes, sure.
Anybody else wish to comment? Okay.
Great. Thank you.
Excellent. In that case, we will move on. Next item is draft minutes of the meeting held on the 8th of May 2024. So members, if you are content that the minutes are a true reflection of proceedings of the meeting held last Wednesday here, people are content, I'll sign the minutes. Okay. The next item is matters arising. The matters arising.
Chair, we may need to skip those now because we're getting very close to time and we've got a significant number of briefings. What we can do is come back to those if members are content.
I suggest that we we move on to our evidence sessions basically, or to our to move straight to evidence. Do you think?
Yes, that probably is our best.
Okay, that's fine.
Just gives us extra time.
Yeah, that's fine. So we're jumping straight to agenda item 7 then, are we? To get our briefings. Okay. So members, we are then, I think, on helpful advice from the clerk. We do have our witnesses waiting outside. So we're going to go straight to an oral briefing from the Fiscal Council. You should have in your pack the helpfully provided and very comprehensive, particularly given the timescale, briefing from the Northern Ireland Fiscal Council. So they're joining us. The briefing, the clerk's memo on that is at page 165 of your meeting pack, and also at page 7 of the tabled pack for reference during the session is both the original and amended written ministerial statement from the Finance Minister on the 24-25 budget, the UK Financial and Economic Indicators 2024, correspondence from the Chief Secretary of the Treasury to the Finance Minister regarding the NI Executive Restoration Package. That's the original correspondence from, I think, February. Correspondence from the Finance Minister to this committee regarding the breakdown of the amounts contained in the package settlement, a copy of the WMS on the 23-24 approach to further forecast underspends, and copies of the 24-25 departmental bids for capital, resource and FTC, which is still excludes the Executive Office. So members, we have the Council briefing us today on their assessment of the draft budget for 24-25, which was emailed to members yesterday and published online. And this is the second of the non-departmental, i.e. external to the department briefings. I shouldn't really have had to explain non-departmental there to this committee. That was a bit fatuous and pompous of me, but in any case, is taking that we are taking in relation to our scrutiny of the draft budget for 24-25. So welcome, very warm welcome to Sir Robert Choate, Dr. Esmond Burney, Maureen O'Reilly and Jonathan McAdams from the Fiscal Council. Thank you very much for being here, and indeed, I should say up front, thank you very much for the comprehensiveness of this document, which has been hugely helpful and hugely welcome, particularly the notice, and I would say as an innovation in the last few years will be really helpful for, I think, scrutiny for all MLAs and indeed the broader public. So thank you all very much for being here, and we'd invite you, Sir Robert, to make an opening statement.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Chair. Good afternoon, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be back. Obviously, very happy to focus on the questions and priorities you have. I guess to kick off, this is, I'm pleased to say, the first occasion on which we've actually been able to fulfil our written terms of reference in reporting on an executive budget and explaining how ex ante at least it balances that. So that's a pleasure in its own right. As you will appreciate, every year of budget management here is different, and on this occasion, obviously, the budget has had to be put together relatively swiftly following the timing of the restoration of the institutions. So there's obviously some differences around process, which you and the rest of the Assembly will obviously be familiar with that. But from our point of view, it's great that it's here and it's possible for us to be looking at it. I guess that if we focus maybe on the obviously the largest element, which is the resource, the day-to-day funding for and spending on public services, there is agreement, not universal obviously, amongst the executive. Health Minister has expressed, has not agreed, but a majority around a budget which 15.2 billion in total, so that's a little under £20,000 per household. saying how sort of big a sum of money that is, it depends on the baseline at which you're comparing it. So we've looked at that in a number of ways. One way is simply to say that in the way in which the Department of Finance has presented it, reflecting the way in which they asked for bids, you would say it is up on the opening position that departments were given at the beginning of the last financial year. However, the amounts of money that departments had to spend in 23-24 were topped up first by Barnett consequentials as a result of increases in UK government spending during the course of the financial year, and then of course the money provided is part of the UK government package to support the restoration. So on that basis, the total amount of money is about 2% lower than departments were working with at the end of the financial year. Interestingly, obviously it's roughly 7% higher than departments were working with at the beginning of the year, and indeed 9% higher than the first budget that was sort of set out in the draft budget that was never agreed in 2021. So incidentally, we're amongst the first to say that it's a very valuable thing to have multi-year budgets. Yep. But if you'd had one then, the picture has actually moved significantly since then, and the amount of money that's there to play for. So in terms of where the money is coming from for 24-25, as ever, the block grant, the core block grant is dominant, roughly 90% of the total. Roughly 5% each comes from regional rates and from the specific amount of money put in as a result of the package. Our best estimate, and obviously we don't entirely know the methodology that the Treasury works on in this, is that as a result of the support package, this is probably in excess of the 124 estimate of relative need, i.e. 24% higher spending per head on against comparable spending.
Just clarify that point, Robert, so meaning that 24-25, the amount of money that the executive has to spend 24-25 is in excess of 124.
Yeah, we estimate between 125 and 120, so 25 to 27% higher per head than equivalent UK government spending in England on the things for which the executive is responsible.
So in this financial year, it is at the level that, in a sense, even the most kind of optimistic account of what need is would be at, certainly for 24-25.
Well, obviously there are different people have different views on what the appropriate number is, and as we explained when we were here before you, we think 124 is a reasonable central estimate, but the precise number does depend on judgments and obviously the period.
Higher than 124 for 24-25.
That's right. So, I mean, questions raised obviously about treatment of agriculture, about in particular policing and justice, where there are reasonable people can entirely disagree on that. But I think it's important, obviously, when you're talking about those need numbers, is that really is sort of relevant in a medium to long-term context. The fact that it's above 124 in 1 year and maybe next year is informative, but only up to a point. Yeah. So, as I say, the package is contributing about 5% to the resource budget this year, and clearly the package as it was set out was providing, roughly speaking, 3 years of stabilising funding for the period of overspending that we had seen before. So a relatively large sum, albeit backdated, for 2023-24, and then 520 million in this year and next year. Now, the reason for having the backdated money for 23-24 was to allow the executive to make the public sector pay awards broadly comparable. The estimate, I think, is that on its own costs around £600 million in 2023-24. Not all of that is recurrent, i.e. some of it is just specific to that year, but most of that 600 million probably flows through into what the executive would need to spend to maintain that pay position, just that pay position, over this year and next year. So one way of viewing the interaction between the pay pressures and the support package is that the support package is essentially paying for the pay deals that were agreed last year for last year, this year and next.
Yeah.
But there is no guarantee that that money is there for 26, 27, the cliff edge of which we have spoken before. So, there are some challenges for the executive, in particular around pay, but not just around pay, in terms of both what can be done this year and next. The Department of Finance has suggested that departments should budget for maybe 3% a year pay increases, but more particularly into 26, 27, when that short-term boost from the support package comes to an end, but before the 24% uplifting of the Barnett formula has really had time to build up to fill the gap.
Yeah, okay.
So happy to expand further. Shall I leave it there? And
that would be helpful. Yes, that's excellent. Unless anybody else in the Maureen, Esmond, or Jonathan have anything particular. Okay, thank you very much. And I'm sure all members will have questions. So indicate to myself or the clerk. So thank you very much, Sir Robert, for that opening presentation. Could I just ask, I suppose, does the Fiscal Council have a view on whether not to turn this into a kind of bun fight between departments, sort of the Department of Health versus the Department of Finance, but you've acknowledged that the starting position for 24-25 is below the end point, the outturn for 23-24 for the Department of Health, but it is above the baseline budget that was set at the start of the financial year. Do you have a view on which is the correct process, i.e. whether it is right to kind of work from the start year or the outturn from the end of the year?
I think that it depends on the purpose for which you're trying to ask the question. So I think it's entirely reasonable for the Department of Finance to ask departments to bid against a lower baseline than where they ended up at the end of the year. So the baselines against which departments were asked to bid was essentially what they were allocated at the beginning of 22-23, taking out earmarked and one-off items. And I suspect that the Department of Finance did that in part to signal that where we ended up last year was not a sustainable position, once again requiring the Treasury to come in and help provide support there. So in that sense, asking people to bid against that lower starting point makes good sense.
Yeah.
As we've seen, that left about just under £1 billion. The Department of Finance could accommodate about £1 billion of bids against those baselines and still balance the budget. What happened is that departments put in bids of around £3 billion. So 3 times as much as the available pot of money that DOF could have allocated. Now, you would always expect in any budget process that bids exceed the amount of money that is available, but this is a larger multiple than has been the case in previous years when typically bids are about 1.6, 1.7 times the total. This is 3. So that's one indication of the pressures that are at play here. In terms of most stakeholders, and those stakeholders probably include the departments, they're probably more interested in, the consequences for the quality and quantity of public services if I as a department or you as a department can spend more or less than you actually ended up spending last year. So I think that's why we've focused and described quite a lot how the settlements look relative to the final plan's position at the end of last year. And as you say, overall, those are lower by about 2%. The picture differs, obviously, across departments. So on this occasion, as I recall, Education and Justice fared somewhat better than average. Health, slightly less well than average. And that would be the flip side of the picture that you had in 2023-24. Health, of course, remains by far the largest chunk of the resource budget, about 50%, fractionally above it. Because of that slightly less than average, their overall share falls fractionally, but the big picture is that the health budget remains essentially half of the day-to-day executive spending on public services. So I think for most people's purposes, the comparison to what departments actually ended up spending over the whole of last year is probably relevant in thinking about what it means for public services this year, but it's a perfectly legitimate way for DOF to manage the budget process, to operate off lower baselines and then describe what's happened relative to those lower baselines.
So, from a sort of theoretical accountancy, public spending control perspective, using year start baselines is a reasonable thing to do, but it is also reasonable from a public service delivery point of view to look at the amount of money that has actually been spent. So in a sense, there's no perfect right answer. I think
there's another issue there that which we discussed, which was the fact that using the start of the year, you don't know what you're going to get through the year.
Of course.
So that's obviously a good way to start. Is that baseline, because that's
you don't know. You could be allocated more.
Yeah.
So can I just ask then on that additional allocation you just mentioned, Maureen? So we know, and you've summarised it well in the paper, and indeed Joanne McBurney from the department confirmed it last week. We know there'll be, tens of millions sort of already that will release already that aren't factored into the 24-25 budget. I just wanted to confirm the council's what the council's perspective on some of this is, kind of marking back and reading across to the restoration package. But there's 47 million which is going to come from the Public Service Transformation Board. So that is, my understanding is
conditional,
which is conditional on setting up the public service. But I think the condition is that it exists, and once it exists, then they get £47 million, or the finance minister has extra 47 million.
I think that's my understanding,
Yeah.
but I think we'll need to wait for the Treasury and DOF to talk about where they've got with the fiscal framework discussions to know exactly how.
We might be hearing about that at some point soon. But we don't know very much about it at the minute. So then there's also the Barnett, the 24 million from the the spring budget, which hasn't been allocated yet. So in addition to that, have the pausing of the debt repayments, has that been properly factored into the 24-25 budget as far as you're aware, or is that still?
Well, on the 24 million again, we may hear about that in the relatively short term.
Yeah.
The issue there is essentially when you start the topping up process.
Yes.
Do you start it at the beginning of 24-25, or do you apply it from the point at which the executive was restored, and that basically brings the UK spring budget Barnett consequentials into or out of scope.
Yeah.
So I think most people are assuming it will end up in scope, but that's above my pay grade. On the debt repayment situation, so there we're essentially talking about the repayment of the short-term support that the Treasury had to provide to cover the 23-24 and so 22-23, 23-24 overspends. And the issue there, I think, is that you need to be putting in place a sustainability plan. Again, we may need to wait not very long necessarily to see exactly what the scope of that has to be. The UK government has already obviously raised the issue of that needs to or should ideally include some element of revenue raising plus presumably other savings plus public service reform, with a plan set out reasonably swiftly, not as swiftly as was being asked for originally, and then some signs of implementation. But that's essentially affecting 25-26. So if that money was demanded back, it's not going to be demanded back in 24-25. It will be demanded back in 25-26, which potentially pulls your cliff edge 1 year earlier.
But will it have any? So if the agreement is reached to pause the debt repayments, will that have an impact on the 24-25 budget in year?
I'm not, as far as I'm aware. I can't see how it would do.
No, it shouldn't do, Chair, because at the moment I think the budget is based on the assumption, as Robert set out, that it would have to be repaid next financial year. Yeah. If it's removed entirely, then it's removed from that financial year.
The financial year, okay, so it's removed. So it's removed from 25-26. Yeah. So it doesn't agreeing that. So that's not an additional in year. So as far, I suppose the question I'm asking, as far as we are aware, the two additional in year monies that could be released from the UK Treasury are, it could be 24 million from the spring budget, but that could also mean if there are further Barnetts in the financial year, that it'd be slightly higher than they would otherwise have been. But the cash amount probably at the minute, if it includes the spring budget, is 24, and the 47 million for So that's what we think will be but then plus there might also be, there may be underspends already for June on.
So the 24 and the 47 might be in play for this. Well, the 24 would be. I mean, that's and the 47. I think you're right. But I mean, on the debt repayment, I think the ask in the UK government package is that a proposal is put out. Originally, they were saying, unrealistically quickly, but I think it's now August, but that there should be sign of implementation in 25. So again, I don't think you would be in a position to say within 24-25 that requirement for a implemented sustainability plan, you wouldn't be able to mark the homework then. Okay. It's too early.
Okay. Now, on some of the broader points that you've made about the way that the budget process could effectively improve. Obviously, as you acknowledge, this has to be turned around extremely quickly. Albeit I would say, purely, and I'm not speaking as a committee chair, I'm speaking myself, I would commend the Fiscal Council for producing a 50 or 60 page document with tables that you were able to present us today, well formatted and very straightforward, but all extremely rigorous. The department's budget statement itself was about 5 or 6 pages with a couple of pages of tables, and to be quite honest, I think that reflects both well on the Fiscal Council and not so well on the executive and department. But that's slightly by the by, and I hope that.
To be fair to them, one of the reasons we're able to produce this is we do have a good working relationship. I mean, there's a different. These are aimed at different audiences.
I'm not asking you to endorse the comparison I've drawn, but I do hope that part of what we see is improved documents and improved presentation and more rigorous presentation. But anyway, that's by the by. You talk in the paper about, and obviously this isn't new, and lots of people, including Pivotal and Neri and everybody who comments on policy delivery here, talks about not just multi-year budgets per se, but multi-year budgets connected to a PFG. Yeah. The view at the minute seems to be that it is unlikely that we may get a PFG before the summer, but it appears unlikely that it will be connected to a multi-year budget, and a multi-year budget may not even be doable until some point next year, whenever the new UK government, hopefully Labour from my perspective, but could whatever composition of that UK government, because they might not do a multi-year CSR until some point in 2025. Would it be possible in your view to do something like an indicative multi-year budget which is contingent on questions which haven't yet been answered by the UK government, but at least allows departments to plan? Is that something? Would that be inadvisable in the absence of a full confirmed spending review?
I think thinking in a medium-term perspective, whatever the budget horizon you're doing, is important to some degree. As you say, there are challenges here in terms of you don't know yet the period over which the UK government is going to set its own spending plans, and therefore you have a reasonable idea of the block grant settlement. You could, however, say let's work on the assumption that it rises from the current level by some amount, and produce some sort of indicative plan on that basis. I would, though, draw you back to this, as I said, the odd comparison of the amount of money that's in the pot for 24-25 is a lot higher than it would have been if you'd agreed the multi-year budget in December 21. Yeah. So even if you did have a 3-year UK government spending plan that allowed you to have draft or initial block grant settlements over a 3-year period, the chances that those settlements, particularly in the out year, are going to look the same by the time you get there are relatively low. So there's always going to be that degree of uncertainty around the amount of money that you have to play with, but you do need to have that medium-term perspective for service delivery, service reform, workforce planning purposes. Now, I think at the moment, the area where this comes in as a particular challenge is if you're thinking over the next 3 years, what do you assume is going to be available to you in 2026-27 when, on the face of it, you have a short-term financial support package that runs out at that point, but you might be wanting to sort of have a view with the UK government of what it's appropriate to assume over the interim. Clearly, the Treasury is not going to come out and sort of give you a firm indication in advance of what the block grant is going to look like when they don't even have their own UK government spending plans. So there's only so far you can go, but if you're trying to think about what a multi-year programme of public service reform, workforce planning looks like, then you have to have that medium-term perspective.
Indeed. So just on one specific question in relation to an area of policy that is a high priority, I think, for basically every party here, which is childcare. And we know we are subpar versus GB on childcare support. I should declare him because I'm a parent with children who are in childcare. But I mean, it would cost. I think I'm right in saying, I haven't got the number in front of me. It will have been in one of your earlier documents, a number for getting back to parity with G, whether it's using the 23 hours or whatever the policy was to get to parity, would cost, I think, in the hundreds rather than the tens of millions. That's correct, Esmond's nodding.
Pretty sure, Chair, but it is correct. Several hundred million.
So there's a 25 million allocation in this budget. We don't yet know how the Education Minister, who has been allocated, is going to spend it. It's welcome. That's better than nothing, obviously. But would it be fair to say that it's hard to see, particularly with things like rising wages and costs generally in the childcare sector, it's hard to see how we get close to parity or equivalent offerings with across the water without either substantial revenue raising or the money coming from somewhere else in the budget?
Yeah, yes, I mean, I wouldn't take, I'm not an expert on exactly how much, yes, but I mean, that's simply a matter of arithmetic. It's got to come from somewhere. Yeah. If the budget remains, balanced, now you can look obviously at savings across the rest of the resource budget. You mentioned that childcare is one of the relatively rare sub-parity areas where policy is less generous than the equivalent policy at the GB level. There are obviously several areas with a total cost, as I dimly recall, of about 600 million of super parity areas. Yeah. Money could obviously come from the super parity areas, but maybe that's what you want to be spending the money on, and you want to take something from elsewhere. But this is a constrained environment, so I think the magicking up several hundred million is certainly not straightforward. Okay, I'll let Mayor's in. I just want one further question from me at this point, which is about ring fencing. So there's been a fair bit of debate about money that was taken out of what were previously agreed integrated education projects. I just, for the purposes of the record, the unring fencing of that money does not remove the funding from those projects. That's true to say. That's beyond my. Do you know? What I mean is that if there is an agreement, in this case there was an agreement nearly a decade ago at Fresh Start, which ring-fenced an amount of capital spending for integrated and shared education projects. It was ring-fenced, which meant executive ministers could not spend it on another thing they wished to, something else. But what was agreed as part of the executive restoration package was that 150 million of that is ring-fenced. The ring-fence would be removed. The question I'm asking is, removing the ring fence does not, it was removed after, by the way, lots of schools had been allocated capital, had been given capital allocations to start planning to build new schools. I just want to ask from your perspective for the record, removing a ring fence is not the same thing as removing agreed funding. I wouldn't have thought so, Jonathan. This is going back beyond my
technical point, if it's okay, Chair. I understand that the ring fence monies that you're thinking about there were capital, but I think when the ring fence was removed, the money that's going to be received in future is going to be resource. Mm-hmm. So, in one sense, if the executive wants, has agreed to that capital, they'll need, and now the money is going to come in the form of resource, they'll have to displace capital from elsewhere, to put it back into that pot if that's what they want to do. But removal of the ring fence gives the executive the ability to do whatever they like with it, with that one caveat that the removing of the ring fence has turned the money from capital to resource effectively. I suppose as far as I understand.
Yeah, if my granny gives me £10 to spend in school books and then says you have to spend this in school books, and then a month later she says, don't worry, you can spend it in whatever you like, that doesn't mean I don't have to spend it in school books. It means that it can be, I have the freedom not to spend it on that thing, and that's, anyway, I just wanted to, because I think there's been a bit of confusion over that. Okay, I'm going to bring in other members now. Vice Chair, Darren Forsyth.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thanks to you all for joining us again today. We're discussing there parity of funding and trying to get in line, and the fact that it takes hundreds of millions for some sort of parity in terms of childcare, and again, just highlighting once again, it's not just the fact that we've been chronically underfunded here in Northern Ireland, but for decades the lower budget that we already were getting was used to have to rebuild this country after terrorist bombing. We were rebuilding our roads, we were rebuilding our hospitals, and we weren't able to invest and build in things, like programmes like our childcare, like railway, so we're even further behind. So it's not just the chronic underfunding, it's the fact that the money that we had been getting for so long was spent on other things as well. But as we look at this budget here, I was just wondering what the Council's assessment was of the actual level of challenge faced by this executive in terms of, like, much has been said about they've got this budget and the challenges they've faced, but I would be keen to know if you have worked with them or reviewed any of their work as to any realisation of efficiencies and effectivenesses within what they're already doing. So by saying the budget is difficult, everyone looks straight to cuts, but has there been any work or any template or any correspondence with the Council on how they actually review the efficiencies of what they're doing already?
Not specifically on that area. Obviously, we did a report looking at sustainability around health, where we had quite sort of a long discussion there of relative performance indicators, many of which you'll be familiar with. But essentially, the reviewing of the efficiency with which public spending is spent is largely an issue for the Audit Office rather than for us. So we haven't had particular, and we certainly don't make any recommendations on across the board the potential for greater efficiency. In the specific case of health, we identified that there were certain areas, for example, relatively long hospital stays in terms of number of days health spent in hospital, that you could argue is evidence of relative inefficiency that would allow you to improve the quality of services if you address that. On the other hand, there may be good clinical reasons for thinking that the rest of the UK keeps people in hospital for too little time. That doesn't seem the most likely of outcomes, but it's not part of our remit to do a value for money study across the rest. You get more of that from Dorinda and the NI Audit Office.
No, absolutely, and I sit on the Public Accounts Committee also, and you often feel like you're only scratching the surface well after the event of the efficiencies not being made. So I'm just, it is something I'm quite interested in. I was wondering, like, there's been much talk recently about the Northern Ireland Civil Service and how it operates, and I was just wondering what the Council's opinion is on the level of expertise in relation to the Northern Ireland Civil Service, the budgeting, the financial management, review of efficiencies and financial planning.
Well, I may come to colleagues who are probably better informed on that. Certainly, in terms of the interaction we have primarily with the Department of Finance, obviously because we're looking primarily at the budget mechanics, but when we have engaged with other departments on the more specialist areas that we've been doing at, I've been very impressed with the quality of the people, the responsiveness, the willingness to share and discuss. So from a very parochial perspective, I wouldn't have any concerns in that area. In terms of the overall, Jonathan, you're probably slightly conflicted on this one as a member of it. But Maureen, any...
Yes, Chair, similar, you have very good experience with Department of Finance in terms of even the point you raised, Chair, about the timing of trying to get reports out. We did have more time, and they worked very, very strongly with us, and particularly in finance, they have to have that detail, so it's very specialist knowledge. And I think you probably have evidence of that from the presentations you've had in finance.
It's a perennial problem the world over, is that pour encourager les autres finance ministries often, and I speak in the presence of a former Treasury employee, that they tend to cut their own cloth very harshly in order to send a signal to everybody else, and sometimes that comes back and bites them later in terms of turnover rates. I'm sure that wasn't the reason why you moved into your current life.
No, maybe originally.
Chair, just to reiterate what colleagues from the Council have said in answer to the Deputy Chair's question, and it's a very interesting question. I think the impression I've had is that in terms of the actual management of the fiscal relationship between the executive and the Treasurer in the UK government. That's all managed well by the civil servants. I think you need to go perhaps to other pieces of evidence about the more general question about whether there have been occasions when policy making at the devolved level has been hindered, perhaps is too strong, but certainly held back a bit by just a sheer lack of capacity, which is almost inevitable when you've got a small, absolute size, small regional civil service. So obviously I'm thinking about the evidence presented in the RHI inquiry, or more recently the COVID inquiry may on occasions point to that. But in terms of our experience, in terms of the fiscal management, although it probably would be true to say that the staff are stressed and under great strain, but they do seem to be highly effective and productive.
I think there's another thing. It's obviously when resources are squeezed, thinking carefully about how you prioritise things is really important. So, with my other hat on as the head of the UK Statistics Authority, I think it would be fair to say that the Northern Ireland NISRA, the Northern Ireland Statistics Agency, is clearly under a budget squeeze, which has forced them to think very carefully about what they are able to produce, and they've had a very good process of engaging with stakeholders about that, because if tough choices have to be made and you're not able to deliver everything that is either being asked of you or that you would like to do, talking to the people who use your outputs is really important in making sure that what are going to be difficult decisions are both substantively as good as possible and they land as well as possible with the people you're serving.
Absolutely, and I think it's something like we've discussed it ourselves as a finance committee, and from a career as an accountant as well. Quite often people turn to the finance staff saying we need to save money, where do we make the cuts? Whereas actually you're trying to add value in terms of the finance to try to find the best efficiencies and what you can do going forward. And I just was wondering that if in the Northern Ireland Civil Service the staff that are providing that financial advice and guidance are getting the full status within the rest of the teams and being heard in terms of their ideas. I just had one other question in terms of the voluntary and community sector. Have you done any work, or would you have any opinion on how we could measure the value or return of investment on the voluntary and community sector here? Because as we see, and as I mentioned previously, whenever we're looking at cutting budgets, a lot of people cut the edge of the services, which they see quite often as the voluntary and community sector, whereas I would feel very strongly that for the smaller amount of money, the return on the investment there is so significant. And I just was wondering, in terms of your role, if that was something you looked at.
Not something to do. It's certainly something when I've been over here and talking at conferences with stakeholders, with representatives across that sector, it's often a point made, and that certainly if you are a department thinking about how you're interested, how you want to allocate resources to deliver the best outcomes that you can, if the voluntary and voluntary sector can do it more cost effectively, and it's better to give money to do that than to do that directly, then it's a false economy to take it away from that sector because it's administratively easier to do so. I don't personally see any evidence that happens. I know it's clearly a concern in that area, but I don't know, colleagues, whether you're closer to that.
I know we had discussed, even we actually had a discussion around, the proportion of the spend that was, public servants, spend as opposed to delivery of services. So I know it's something that we want to maybe look into in more detail, just to understand, if services are being cut, then who's doing them? If pay, for example, still has to be maintained. So that's something I think going forward we'll probably look at in more detail.
Absolutely, because there are some services that aren't delivered here by central government, like support services for organisations like Women's Aid, a lot of mental health organisations. I know in the Southern Trust area last year, I had trust employees on to me saying there was over 10,000 people that they would have nowhere they could possibly refer them to any service if these organisations weren't funded. So I just would be very interested as to how we capture that and show how we quantify it. But ultimately it's in terms of outcomes, not necessarily pound signs, so it's a difficult thing, I appreciate.
It is, and it's a difficult thing to back, because it's an area where you'd want, departments, arm's length body of departments, local councils and the voluntary sector, that network all has to work together in an imaginative and open way, and you can see plenty of examples where that happens in some of the areas, and for younger people as well, supporting that where that does happen. I don't know whether the audit office has done anything specifically on how well those cross-sectoral things fit together. It's something certainly we're aware of, but it's not something we've done anything specific on.
No, I appreciate it, thank you. It's just often it comes to a crisis and ends up on the floor, like my colleague with the Northern Ireland Hospice recently, and Nexus Sexual Counselling support. So thank you very much.
Okay, Owen Tennyson.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Robert, for all of your answers so far. Just returning to the Chair's question around the comparison of health spend between last year and this year. I think it's the figures of 6% increase and 2% cut have been selectively quoted depending on political perspective largely. Is it fair to say that given the financial package was arrived at, neither are a perfect comparator, and actually once we get to compare an end of year outturn to last year's outturn, the actual figure will be somewhere between those two numbers?
And there's a reasonable case, looking back, yes, if you're able to compare the same point in the year across it, and I think final to final is a good way to do that, then that's helpful. Obviously, in terms of talking about a budget, the best thing we can do is to compare like with unlike in that sense. But no, I think you're right. And again, often in these cases, it's really a medium-term picture. There can be volatility from year to year. I mean, for example, some of the comparisons with, changes relative to baselines, if there are technical adjustments, if there have been particular reasons why money needs to move between departments during the course of a financial year, then again, if you make a comparison just before one of those has happened to just after one of those happens, that can confuse the picture as well. So it's not straightforward.
So that's helpful. And just in terms of the reflections at the end of the report that's been published, the Fiscal Council highlights in particular the lack of buy-in from the Health Minister. Can you elaborate on why the Fiscal Council felt it was important to highlight that and what the potential impacts from your perspective might be?
Well, I think obviously having a universally agreed package would be the most desirable outcome, I think. There's a particular issue, obviously, that health is the largest chunk of the budget by far. So the degree to which the executive as a whole under or overspends its budget and the consequences that may have for interactions with the Treasury and what needs to be done is disproportionately determined by what happens in health relative to what happens, important though it is, in agriculture or the smaller spending departments, for example. Now, clearly what you would not want to imply is that by not supporting the health settlement within this budget, that means that the Minister is not going to do his best to stick within the budget. There will, that's choices for that to take. So what we're not implying here is that that is to be taken as a signal that I'm not going to stick to this because I didn't agree with it in the first place. That's obviously something to explore with him and the department further. But that's not an implication we're trying to make. But clearly having universal agreement and a bit more concern about the concerns coming from health. But as I say, that partly may reflect the fact that on this occasion health did, relatively speaking, slightly less well than other departments, whereas the previous year it was the other way around.
And again, that's helpful, thank you. Just turning then to the capital allocations, and I know, if I understood you right earlier, you rely predominantly on the audit office in terms of value for money assessments in that regard. So there are a number of earmarked and ring-fenced projects, one of which is the Strual Education Campus, and those schools have waited a long time on capital investment, and I understand entirely the support for them. But that particular project was flagged by the Independent Review for Education as not providing value for money and potentially either constraining capital spend on other school builds in the medium term unless there was a significant increase in capital investment. We haven't seen an increase significantly in terms of capital investment. The Audit Office has echoed the Independent Review's concerns, and there's no business case for that project. In terms of the process, in terms of how we arrived at those earmarked projects for capital spend, does the Fiscal Council have a view or an assessment of that? I know that's a fairly long-winded question, but
Yeah, well, on the specifics of Stroll, I may pass on to colleagues who may have just to take a step back and look at the capital budget overall, we're talking about 2 billion-ish here. On the face of it, this looks to have had a tougher squeeze than the resource budget. In overall, it's down 7 compared to, not just to the opening position at the end of last year, but also to the final plans towards the end of the year, because neither the Barnett consequentials nor the package have put more money into the capital budget through last year in the same way that they did for the resource budget. So the only way in which the support package has increased the overall envelope for capital spending is by increasing the amount of borrowing that's possible from 200 to 220 million. The process for bidding in capital is different from bidding in resource. So rather than having a baseline and bidding above or much less likely below that, we're talking here about categorising projects from a zero base as being inescapable, pre-committed, I forget always the third one, and desirable. And on this occasion, there wasn't enough money even to cover the first two of those. In terms of the specific
I can't remember if it's a flagship, but I suppose what I would say is that we did look during the caretaker minister period a little bit at ministerial directions, and we did look a little bit at that, which is obviously how things can happen without a business case. And we did look a little bit at that during the COVID period and the caretaker budget period, but we haven't gone back to it. And we haven't gone back to look at the flagship projects, but I know that the audit office have done capital projects a couple of times now, so they probably have a clearer picture of how these have evolved over time.
I suppose there's a general point, just as I think the Chair was referring to the programme for government. Ideally we would have the investment strategy in place alongside or ahead of the budget, but we don't. We are where we are.
thank you. And you mentioned there, Robert, that the process of commissioning bids is different for capital and resource. Is there merit in future, or is it even possible or desirable to take that zero baseline approach for resource spend?
Good question.
Well, I don't think it's quite as realistic, given the way in which a decision on you're not going to start straight away with, am I going to have the same number of health service workers as I did last year, and start from should we have zero. There is just more recurrent decisions with recurrent consequences that go through the budget. But there is an argument, and certainly in the UK context, there are times when you have spending reviews and there are times when you have comprehensive spending reviews. How much more the comprehensive spending review is comprehensive than a normal one, maybe more in the eye of the beholder than in the reality, but it would be good practice periodically to take a greater step back and to say, are there just simply things here that we're doing that we don't need to do, we're doing but it's not very good, so we should just stop it. There are better and more efficient ways of doing this, and thinking about essentially what you want the functions of the state to be and the structure of the public sector. Periods of budget stress and difficulty, the paradox is that would seem simultaneously to be more desirable to do it at those times, and also more difficult to do it at those times, because you're wrestling with the sort of public sector pay planning issues that the departments have all been wrestling, in health in particular, over the last couple of years.
That's helpful. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, so Steve, you can...
Thanks, Sir Robert, and thank you very much indeed, and Stephen. Thank you very much indeed for a very comprehensive report. Thank you for doing that. Just a couple of questions. First one, you'll notice we have gone for a vote on an account which basically gives us 65% of availability to spend over the period of time. And part of the reason for that vote of account going out is that we would have more time to sort out our priorities, do a programme for government, do some consultation. We've done none of that. Yet, from the conversation we've had already, you've pointed out the fact that there are conversations going on behind the scenes and looking at other monies and to do that as well. What's the Fiscal Council's view on the speed with which we're bringing this forward, where in your own report you quite clearly say that we haven't done a programme for government, we haven't prioritised, and we haven't done any sort of consultation?
Yes, I mean, in an ideal world, you would have,
It's just specifically because we went for a vote on account for 65%, which is quite unusual as well, so that would give us more time. Yet here we are, seemingly charging ahead.
Yes, I think, well, as we've seen in the past, when the vote of account period draws to a close, there are other ways in which the can be kicked further down the road in this department. So I think it's not surprising that you've seen a larger vote for account than on previous occasions. Whether that is a meaningful constraint on how quickly an executive would seek to bring together a PFG, knowing that there are other ways of essentially ensuring that the whole of the public services don't just sort of collapse or spending just stops at some stage beyond that. So it seems to me that it's a recognition of reality, whether it's a particularly powerful stimulus to the executive to move more quickly than it otherwise would do. I would leave to others to say whether history points in that direction.
Okay, very diplomatic answer, well done. Second question is about the issue to do with sort of the UK as a whole, and looking at increases in health and education spending. If you look at sort of England, I'm not so sure about Wales, and I'm not 100% certain about Scotland, but on average they have been above the line, whereas we, with this particular settlement, health is below the line. And regardless of whether you take a baseline from a year, a 23, 24, when we were originally looking at it, I mean, many of us sat around in conversations then with the Department of Finance while we were in our interregnum, and the conversation was that we were being given basically a punishment budget to get us back into government. So it seems quite strange to be using that as a baseline when we know where we were against the rest of the UK. So bearing in mind, sir, in your report you say that sort of in sort of the rest of the UK, health and education are ahead of the baseline, and here in Northern Ireland we're below the baseline. Is there any rationale for that? Any particular rationale for that? Or is that just the way the prioritisation of the budget was made by the Finance Minister?
Well, as you know, the way the block grant works is that the Barnett consequentials, although they will arise from a particular mixture of, part of it's because health spending in England has gone up by X or education spending in England has gone up by X, the executive is not constrained to spend that money in the same areas that have generated the money in the first place. And that's entirely reasonable, therefore. So to some degree, these are the choices that the executive has made, not with universal agreement in this particular...
Declaration of interest, of course, for our party
quite
holds the health minister, as you might.
Quite understood.
Yeah.
The relative generosity or not, or whether it's above or below average or appropriate, does depend on the different metrics that you're looking at. So, as I say, at one level you would say that on this occasion, health has received a smaller increase than average and education and justice more, but on the other hand, would you say that's a correction from the previous year in which an awful lot of money did go into health? The other way, which we are the first to concede is a very imperfect comparison, is to say, how do the increases or decreases in departmental budgets here from last year to this year compare to what the equivalent UK government one would do? And there, in most departments, there's a bigger increase for departments here than in the UK, but in health and education, the big ones, there's less. But is that, again, a reflection of the fact that more money was put in here last year, and you wouldn't want to say that was a bad idea just because it makes the comparison this year look less favourable. So at the end of the day, it's for the executive to decide how it divides up the cake. As you point out, across not just the UK, not just GB and Northern Ireland, but across the world, there's upward pressure on health budgets in particular, partly from demographics, but more particularly from the non-demographic cost pressures. So to see a large slice of the cake being given to health and a sort of underlying pressure for the size of that, relative size of that cake to get even bigger, not unique to here.
Right, okay. And sort of my final question, nobody else has mentioned it, but I'm going to mention it. The question of revenue raising. Everything seems to be taken off the table. We've had the Economy Minister took off tuition fees. We've had the Infrastructure Minister has taken off everything to do with sort of water charges. Everything seems to have been taken off the table. Nothing has been put on the table. and sort of, I hate using those horrible terms, but inescapable pressures that are going to continue to build, as you very clearly outlined. You know, we're just continuously chasing £500 million a year. Yet we have an opportunity, potentially, if we were taking grown-up decisions, to look at what we were likely to do or even to discuss it. But everything seems to be taken off the table. What's the perspective of the Fiscal Councils on the fact that everything that we would have looked at to try and increase the size of the cake has been reduced?
Yeah,
or even, no, not even reduced, actually we're not even taking the ingredients to bake the cake.
Well, let me come to colleagues as well. I mean, there's a number of factors at play here. One, I think any sensible government or any administration in any jurisdiction should be thinking about revenue, spending, composition, size on both of those within the constraints that they are presented. There's clearly the challenge here that the block grant is so large as in the proportion of the resource budget that it pays for, that given that at the moment the regional rates are the only tax lever that the executive has, that you'd have to pull that lever jolly hard to make a very big difference to the overall size of the spending pot, which is not to say that it's not something that shouldn't be considered. There are, of course, all the old favourites, some of which you've described, on the domestic water charging, you name it, that could be considered as well. Now, there's, at the moment, the additional stakes have been raised here by the UK government's insistence that revenue raising, and they've given an example how firmly wedded they are to it's got to be 113 million and 112 isn't enough. Well, you know, but that's got to play some part in the sustainability plan. And if you don't do that, then you're going to lose essentially 500 million or thereabouts from the executive spending pot in 25-26. You know, yes, households are under financial pressure at the moment. I can quite understand why people do not wish to increase that financial pressure. But if you take 500 million out of the public services budget in 2025-26, that has consequences for households as well, not directly in their pocket, but potentially also consequences that fall on poorer households rather than those who on average would be paying the regional rate. So there's not straightforward, but I think certainly our view would be that any sensible administration, any sensible government will be thinking about their revenue options as well as their spending ones. I don't know whether...
Yeah, very much. Thank you, Dr. Aiken. I very much endorse what Sir Robert said there. So obviously, as part of our remit as the Fiscal Council, we are not in the business of telling you or the executive what policies they should adopt, and revenue raising would be a policy. Having said that, what we can point to are the constraints and the mathematics of the situation, and by not having revenue raising, the budget envelope is smaller than it would otherwise have been. So it certainly needs serious consideration, and simply to, in a very preemptive sense, if that's what's happened, to rule out X, Y and Z may not lead to a helpful policy debate.
And just for your indulgence, Chair, just a very quick one. You were saying that we're probably anticipating, actually, we're not at 124, we're probably at 125, between 125 and 127. If that's the case, therefore, the delta between what Northern Ireland pays and what the average of England and Wales is per household is about £800, isn't it? Does that significantly affect that figure as well if we're already at 125, 127? Because that would mean that that £800 figure would probably be greater.
I don't think it actually affects that figure. I think the figure you're referring to there, Dr. Aiken, is the, and admittedly, I think it's 2021-22 figures for the sum of council tax plus water charge in England, Scotland and Wales. It varies between the three nations compared to the average domestic rate here.
It was Paul Johnson's work that I remember looking at the figures, but it was about £800, I think.
Yeah, it is.
Okay.
I mean, if you did that and that was a permanent source of future revenue, then that's going to be lifting your 1-2x number that bit higher, and would do so on an ongoing recurrent basis. So that would be changed. And it's clearly the regional rates are the main lever that administrations, that both the Secretary of State and the Executive has had to pull. I think one thing to bear in mind on the domestic water charging front is that if you were to go down that route, you'd probably end up having to compensate poorer households. The effects of that. So maybe the number you might get if you multiply it straight through by the number of households, that's probably an overstatement of the difference it can make, because you're not going to dump that on the doormat of every household in Northern Ireland.
Thanks very much, Dave. Thanks, Tim.
Okay. Jerry Carroll, who's joining us remotely. Jerry.
Yeah, can you hear me okay?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Yeah, thanks for the presentation. A couple of quick questions. Has the council looked at, or can they outline difference in borrowing powers, what's available here to the executive and other jurisdictions in Wales or Scotland, if possible?
We did look at the borrowing powers back in the introductory guide, and I'm now struggling to remember. I think that per capita, the borrowing power for capital is greater here per head than it is in Scotland and Wales, and that is because the executive fulfills some of the functions that local authorities fulfil in Scotland and Wales. Local authorities are able to borrow, and so the Treasury accepted the argument that there should be a greater ability per head to borrow pounds for capital spending here. On the resource side, the executive, clearly unlike the UK government, is not able to borrow to finance day-to-day spending on public services. In Scotland and Wales, there's a greater ability to essentially run a reserve, which allows you to smooth out the variations in funding in order to maintain a smoother path for spending than is the case here. And the Treasury has been willing to allow Scotland and Wales to have that greater flexibility, in part because more tax powers have been devolved to them, which actually, in addition to obviously giving them the ability to do things with those tax powers, exposes them to greater risk in terms of the revenue that they're losing. So in the case of Scotland, the devolution of tax powers in Scotland, they've had to quote unquote raise taxes in order to stand still, because the block grant adjustment has more than outweighed the revenue that's been foregone, whereas in Wales the story is different. So, to summarise, I think there's a bit more ability to borrow for capital, less ability to borrow for resource to smooth over, but that's reflective of the fact that the executive has different functions and powers than either the Scottish Government or the Welsh Government.
Appreciate that. I appreciate if your team could forward that paper, if possible, to the committee. Just another question: has the council looked at over the last, say, 3 to 5 years or thereabouts, money in total handed back to the Treasury? I think in 2019, 150 million was handed back in unspent FTC. So is there a collective figure the last number of years about what was totally in total handed back to the Treasury?
I don't know about a total. It has to be said that FTC, is an unusual example here. So this, as members will know, is money that can only basically be lent to or used as a capital injection into private sector bodies, albeit private sector bodies including universities. The Barnett consequentials that generate the FTC money arise essentially when the UK government is taking measures to support the English housing market, oversimplifying somewhat sharply, and none of the devolved administrations have found that a particularly effective tool to meet their investment requirements. So I think all of the devolved administrations have routinely underspent their FTC budgets because it's just the money doesn't come in a helpful form. I mean, there are areas where it's been used, Ulster University being a case in point, so this is entirely appropriate to support my colleague to my right. But it's not been a very flexible...
It helps your overspend,
in the other areas, I think that obviously budget exchange, there is a limit on the amount of underspending. So if the executive underspends its resource budget, the Treasury allows the executive to carry some of that forward into additional spending in the following year, but subject to a limit, and on occasion those limits are met and some of that's been handed back. So the danger there obviously is that on the one hand it creates an incentive, oh goodness me, let's quickly spend this money on anything to stop us having to send it back to London, which is not a desirable position to be in, but also there may be cases when you could make a perfectly good case for spending money in the next year rather than in this year, and the Treasury rules don't get you that far. But Jonathan may know whether we've ever added that up.
No, we haven't done a total on the FTC money handed back. And just wanted to note as well that the amount of FTC this year is lower. I think in previous years there has been quite a significant chunk, and the executive has struggled even more to if you like, to spend those larger sums. But no, we haven't done a 10-year run of that data or anything.
Okay, so if that changes, let us know. That'd be useful. Another question, and then is the point about the tax avoidance and tax evasion. This is rarely talked about when revenue raising is proposed. So I don't think the council has looked at that in particular, as in if the Westminster government clamped down, how much money would be available for services here. So that's just maybe a side point. And then one final point, I'm quite concerned about when it comes to conversations about revenue raising, the old points about charging twice for water or for other public services is often trotted out, and I think we should obviously rule those measures out, either for two reasons really. Primarily because they are an attempt to satisfy dangerous Tory austerity logic, and also the implication would be to further, if they're implemented, to further impoverish working class communities and people across the board. So I just want to state that I and my party disagree in the strongest possible terms about people being charged twice for services they've already paid for over decades, and I hope the committee would endorse that view generally.
Thanks, Jerry. There's a couple of points there. One, there's a very long-standing debate as to whether people are actually double charged for water or not. So I think views would differ on whether that's been the case or not. The average size of the bill is clearly lower, but then also so would incomes and average house prices in Northern Ireland as well. So it's not a straightforward comparison to make on that front. In terms of tax avoidance, obviously, in terms of the amount that the Assembly and the Executive have to spend, avoidance of the rates, either domestic or non-domestic, has a direct impact on the amount of money that's in play. If the UK government were to manage to crack down on tax avoidance and indeed tax error and to bring more revenue in, the consequences for Northern Ireland would depend on what they did with it. So if they used it to reduce borrowing or to cut other taxes, that's not going to feed through to the block grant here. If they chose to spend more than they otherwise would, then that is beneficial because it feeds through to the Barnett consequentials. But there's quite a sort of tenuous link between what the UK government does on tax avoidance versus what happens on the available or the amount of money to spend on public services here. On the, you'll forgive me for not taking the opportunity to leap up on the austerity argument, tempting as that is. I just return to there's a specific issue because of the link between the UK government's request/demand that there should be some revenue raising and the potential demand for the short-term support that's been provided to cover overspends to come back. So, there's a tough choice. If the Treasury was absolutely serious about saying we're going to take 500 million away from the budget that the Executive has to spend on public services in 25/6 versus would you increase taxes on domestic properties, that is likely to be regressive. You're more likely to hit poorer working households from the hit to public services than you are from the increase in regional rates, but that revenue could come from other places. And that's a specific issue just because of the particular structure of this particular package.
Okay. Gary, is that you finished?
Yeah, I think just your last point, Robert, is like, are you going to be kicked in the face or kicked in the stomach? It's still a kick nonetheless, but I appreciate your comment on that.
Thank you, Jerry.
Okay, Philip Brett.
And I might use that analogy in the future, Jerry. That's the first one. Apologies for being late. My previous committee ran over. Just wanted to check. So obviously the Department of Finance anticipates some additional allocations throughout the financial year, so probably some stuff still outstanding from Fresh Start. Is there a belief then that there will also be additional Barnett awards to Northern Ireland through this?
Well, the additional Barnett awards will depend on whether there are increases in UK government spending through the rest of this year. There's the 24 million that is basically, do you get the uplift to the Barnett consequentials that came out of the spring budget in the UK? I think most people would expect that'll turn up at some point, but there's no guarantee of that. As you say, there are some other elements that, for reasons that I have to say I'm still don't entirely understand, the executive is not allowed to put into the budget until they have been confirmed by the Secretary of State, and is that Fresh Start money?
Yeah, and it's a requirement of the Northern Ireland Act. I think that the finance minister is only allowed to put forward a budget that totals a total that has been set by the UK government. So until it's formally confirmed, that money can't be included.
That doesn't seem to me hugely helpful to transparency or budget planning, but I'm sure there may be complicated reasons why that's in the place. But it has to be said, those sums of money are relatively small compared to the total. So it's not going to make these additional pots of expected cash are not going to be game changers in terms of the amount the executive has to spend overall.
Tens of millions? Is that
Yes, probably. 47 plus 24 plus some Barnett consequentials, yes, could be in that.
But they need to raise the 113 million, so it's kind of, there's two sides to it.
Okay, just in relation to the revenue raising, just on page 42 of your report, so uplifting or introducing other fees and charges. What are you talking about there? University fees, public travel? I know Steve said that ministers have rolled things off the table, but maybe he's putting prescription charges back on the table. What are you talking about there?
Those are the sorts of things, many of them are the sort of the super parity areas that we were describing earlier. I think that again, with many of these, they make a difference at the margin. They're not game changers. The prescription charges issue, I think, again, how big the difference is when, effectively, given the number of people who are exempt from the prescription charges in England, is it actually that big a gap between the generosity of the policies? So, there's a number of areas that I think have been covered in the consultation exercise that the Secretary of State put under place. They're not trivial. They're not trivial sums of money, but they're not going to change by 10% the amount the executive has to spend.
Maybe I'm wrong, but I actually don't think that consultation ever took place on a lot of the revenue raising items. The Department of Finance
stopped it.
Is that right? So I just wondered, have you done it?
Yes, yeah, indeed. This is on there was the consultation that happened, which had 1,400 responses.
That was on the rates.
That was in the rates, yeah. But there was the broader revenue raising did not happen.
So I just wondered, had you done any work, has the council done any work in terms of what the university fees, prescription, travel, etc., may or may not be?
Not recently. I mean, when we did our initial guide, when we started off, I think the Department of Finance's estimate at the time was that the super parity measures in total were about 600 million. Yeah. You then have childcare obviously going in the other direction. And on so some of the super parities around welfare, mitigations, plus the other things that you've mentioned.
FTC, Jerry has covered, so you don't think Northern Ireland is out of kilter with the other devolved regions in terms of its difficulty in spending? No, okay. And then what's next for the Fiscal Council then? You've done the budget. What's the
we're constantly surprised and delighted by what comes along the road for us to have a look at. And it's worth making the point. I mean, as you know, we have terms of reference which require us to produce an annual report on how the budget is balanced, and then also a longer-term sustainability report. We've necessarily had to interpret that somewhat flexibly since we've started, and essentially we try to produce what we think will be of most use to you and the wider community. So I think, you know, if there are announcements that come out of the UK government and DOF on the shape of how the fiscal framework is going to evolve, whether the sustainability plan, the element that tries to avoid the repayment of the debt, if that's something that we want to come and look at, we'll do that. As I say, we do have work underway on another sustainability report. The first one focused on health, the second one we're thinking of transport and water. But, you know, the aim, certainly hope to do that this year. But if other stuff comes along the way, then we'll focus on what we think will be most useful to you. And obviously, if there are particular areas that you think would be of value, then we're very keen to hear that.
Have you had any further discussions with the department in relation to legislation that the Minister had indicated that she would be bringing forward?
Not further. We wait and are ready and happy to engage with that further. As I say, I think, well, just coming back to the immediate past point that we've made, I think when you get to legislating for us, a recognition of the fact that it's probably quite useful to give us the flexibility in discussion with others about what outputs we produce, rather than being too prescriptive about you must do this once a year, you must do that once a year. I've really enjoyed doing this job, and one of the first lessons I had was to stop asking how does this normally work, because there never seems to be an answer to that question, and therefore
it doesn't, I think, is the answer.
Framing a very directive terms of reference about how things normally work when they never work normally would be something I would warn against.
Okay. So next is Nicola Brogan, who's coming in remotely. Nicola.
Thanks, Chair. Can you hear me there okay?
Yep.
Yeah.
Thanks. And thanks very much for your presentation. Robert, if I can just bring you back to discussion around multi-year budgets, or in this case, the one-year budget. First of all, can you just give me an assessment of the impact that one-year budgets have on our public services here? And I take your point about the multi-year budget that Conor Murphy had drafted in the last mandate, and if that had been agreed upon, that the actual finances there would have been less finances available for this here financial year than there is now because of the financial package. But would it be fair to say that because that budget wasn't agreed, and then because there was no Assembly and Executive, and then we had the punishment budget from the Secretary of State imposed on us instead, that really did leave our public services in an even worse state, that maybe the level of need is now greater because of that there? Do you think that's a fair thing to say?
Yeah, I think, well, taking those in turn, on the multi-year budgets in general, I mean, this is now the 10th successive single-year budget. To have a multi-year budget here, you need the combination of a multi-year spending review from the UK government that gives you a multi-year settlement for the block grant, plus you need the institutions to be stable and functioning over the same period, and those two things haven't coincided in the recent period. And as the Chair said, it's possible that, you know, if there is a change of government, or even if there isn't a change of government, maybe at the UK level it might be another single-year budget there rather than straight into a multi-year one, which would make that more problematic still. Clearly, having a multi-year, a relatively stable outlook, albeit one which can change, as you acknowledged, is desirable if you're trying to think about public service reform, workforce planning. That's not something you want to be thinking about in a one-year time horizon. And as we were discussing earlier, the fact that you only have one-year budgets shouldn't preclude you from trying to do some of that long-term thinking. In terms of whether it was the absence of a multi-year budget that caused the particular spending control challenges of the last couple of years, as I think we've emphasised in previous reports, there are multiple factors at play there, one of which is pay and inflation pressures which weren't unique to Northern Ireland, they were true across the UK. the long-standing issues of the Barnett squeeze and therefore the squeeze on the relative generosity of the block grant, and then the particular issues raised by the absence of an executive and assembly, so moving from basically having an assembly and an executive that can set a budget, to then having an executive that couldn't agree a budget, to then having responsibility handed to caretaker ministers who knew they weren't going to be in power at the end of the year, then moving to accounting officers plus the Secretary of State, then moving back to that. The part of that period in which no one was fully in charge is not a recipe for good public finance management, and that would have been true whether you'd inherited a multi or a single year budget through that period. So there are different elements at play there, and I think I've probably forgotten the final part of your question, which you may now need to remind me of.
No, I think that was it, Robert, really.
Very good.
You covered that, yeah. No, thank you for that. I wanted to ask you as well, Steve had mentioned this here about the programme for government. In fact, the one hasn't been agreed yet. And I do think it's very important that the executive do get the time and space to do it correctly, to create the programme for government correctly and put out consultation out there. I do think that's important. But do you think there are issues in not having that in place before budget is set?
Ideally, you want money to follow strategy. You want to have an idea of what the executive is trying to achieve, what its key priorities are, and to ensure that the money goes where those are. There are obviously clear challenges in a multi-party coalition and the nature of the debates that have to happen to do that, and so it's not surprising that it's not straightforward to agree a PFG in the same way it's not straightforward to agree a budget, an investment strategy. But in particular, it's important for those areas or those goals or ambitions that the executive have that span departments. Because, there again, it's a more complicated process of making sure that the money is in the right place, because it is built into the system here, obviously, that departments are relatively siloed compared to at the UK level. Not that they run things terribly well, but that does complicate matters further. So a multi-year budget, a PFG embodying a strategy that you can follow the money to link to it is a very valuable thing, and the sooner we get there, the better. And ideally you'd be thinking about them at the same time, or the strategy first. It's not an ideal thing to be thinking about the strategy afterwards.
Okay, fair enough. And just following on from that there, and discussions already this afternoon about childcare, and we know that childcare is going to be a priority from the executive and hopefully part of that programme for government. And I know that the discussions earlier was about the cost that it's the 33 hours have in England, their model. And obviously it is going to be expensive for here as well, but here, whatever kind of model we do come up with. But can you see the importance of that healthy investment into the childcare sector here in regard that there's so many reasons it's important when it comes to child development and for driving down the cost of parents and that as well. But in regards to economic growth and even around gender equality and that as well, bringing more women back into the workforce. We've had a majority of women have had to give up work because of childcare needs. So can you see the importance of their investment for economic growth?
Yes, I think there's widespread, we've not looked at that specifically, but I think, as you say, there's widespread recognition of the fact that this can have social objectives, distributional objectives in terms of the well-being of children, the well-being of families, but also that it can be a way of increasing, in particular women's, but more generally labour market participation and therefore potential GDP and the strength of the economy. So there are multiple reasons to think about why you want to structure your childcare policy in the way that you do. Obviously, different people will have different views on the extent to which the state should be incentivising or encouraging labour market participation, care at home, etc. So it's not a completely uncomplicated story, but as you say, there's both social and economic dimensions to it. I don't know if anybody else is.
Just to add the obvious point that yes, this is an identified investment area, but there are competing demands and public funds for capital investment. So it would yield, as Sir Robert says, certain economic and social returns, but do bear in mind that in the fixed pot, if X amount is allocated to childcare, it will not be available for whatever, water investment, roads, digital investment, training, or whatever. And that is obviously the dilemma that will face the executive.
Yeah, no, it's fair. Listen, folks, thanks very much for that there, and thank you, Chair.
Okay, Paul Frew.
Thank you, Chair. I'll try to be quick. In the report, you talk about 3 dilemmas facing each minister. Should we raise more money for public services? If so, how? Where should we look to save money through better efficiencies? And then do we need to reduce or completely stop delivering any services? Is there not a 4th dimension to that, whereby ministers should be looking at where they can invest to save? Or is that a phrase now that's sort of confined to the history books?
Yeah, I would say it's part of the second one of those, in terms of are there ways of doing things that you're currently doing more efficiently? And often if you're doing that, for example, if you could do it by revamping an IT system or changing a set of employment contracts, that quite often involves an upfront cost. And there may be circumstances in which spending, £10 today will help save you far more than that over future years. I think it would be fair to say that if you work in a finance ministry, every day of the week departments come along and say, give me £200 million this year and I'll save you an awful lot over the next 3 decades. And what economists would call, discounted rate of time preference, i.e. how much notice you pay to this year versus promised things 5, 6, 7 years down the line, is not straightforward. And finance ministries typically want the ratio of save to invest to look pretty high to offset the likelihood that it involves over-optimism and the possibility that you do the invest but you never get the save.
Although whilst we are probably 10 years ago, we would have talked about efficiency savings in the fact of just reducing burden of cost, we are probably looking now at failing infrastructure which will cost life. So how and where do you get the equation of how much do we actually have to invest to revamp our sewage system in order that we don't have people dying because of our sewage system in 10 years' time? And we're at that level now.
Well, all the discussions that we've had about relative need in terms of how much you're spending, say, on your health service today in terms of the running costs of it, that's quite complicated to do, and different people will reach different views on that. In terms of the quality of the stock of capital that you have and what you would need to do to get it to a comparable basis is an even harder thing to judge, and it's somewhere where I think, in our examination of particular sectors, we found it easier to judge the relative need in terms of the day-to-day spending than in terms of how big is your infrastructure deficit. As you say, there are particular areas where this can matter, but I mean, so too can resource spending in terms of people's lives. I mean, how much you're putting into, care for vulnerable people, the health system also has those sorts of implications in the same way. In some areas, there's also longer-term considerations. So the argument often made, but doesn't need to be exclusively around water charging, is if you were to sort out the sewage system, not only does that have the implications for human lives and day-to-day well-being, but it also provides a basis for having a much more vibrant development sector and more building and more opportunity, which is good socially and good for economic growth as well. So those factors come into play on both, I think.
And it is fair to say that even if the British government was to fund us higher than need, a budget here in the wrong place, targeting the wrong things, could actually completely negate that rise.
That's true of any budget set in any place. It's the choice of the in a democracy of the assembly, of the administration to choose where those allocations are made. And as Esmond says, with a given pot of money, and for somewhere like Northern Ireland, there is not the flexibility to borrow for day-to-day spending that the UK government has and arguably overuses. £500 million that is not spent on or is spent on sewerage isn't available for childcare, isn't available for education, and those choices to govern is to choose.
Let me put you onto the programme for government now. I harp on about this all the time about you need it in order to have a programme. In order to have a programme for government, because it should be funded, and that funding should be the budget, and the two overlap each other. Yeah. One is the roadmap, the other one is the vehicle. And I'm aware that the legislation was changed and there was an extension allowed for ministers to agree a programme for government, and they extended that period by 7 days. So here we are now, 100 days on. Does the Fiscal Council have a view as to how long a programme for government should take to agree?
I think that depends on the people who are having to agree it very largely, and how straightforward this. I mean, I think if you go back to the earlier period in which there was that change, that was that was the more normal times when an executive would be formed. People would have a reasonable idea when it might be there, and therefore the process of rolling the pitch for that would mean that it's more realistic to come. Now, clearly, in recent months, it wasn't at all clear when the institutions were going to be back, so the idea that you were able to get all of that pitch rolling in place, Jane and Brady and colleagues at the NICS, I think, done their level best to do as much of that in the background as it was possible to do. But realistically, if you don't know when the executive is coming back, it comes back, particularly at a point very close to the end of the financial year. That's not straightforward. You're absolutely right about the relationship between the PFG and the budget, and it is in both directions. So yes, having a programme for government that guides your budget is the sensible way of thinking about it, but because you are not determining your budget envelope realistically, there's only so much you can do to add to the block grant from regional rates. The programme for government also needs to have a realistic view of the amount of money that there would need to be, that you would have available to spend on it. There's no point in having a programme for government that's got bells and whistles all over it, and then you turn around and say, oh, actually, we don't have the budget for this. The two need to come together.
With regards to the invest to save piece, I said, should that be in a programme for government, or should that be in the sustainability plan?
It's an interesting question. I wouldn't be surprised to see if the executive were to make a case to the Treasury for saying this is a programme that will strengthen the public finances of Northern Ireland over the longer term, please support this, that invest to save could be an element of that. And in the past and in this, there's often been earmarked money for transformation, which is partly the invest. It's another word for the invest that is supposed to save, or invest to improve, increase the quality and quantity of outputs, not necessarily to save money, could be for that reason as well. So it wouldn't at all surprise me if the executive wants to make some of those cases as part of a discussion around sustainability. What I would say, though, is the Treasury has seen a lot of claims that we, give us the money to invest and we will save, and looks at it with characteristic scepticism.
The programme for government, the draft programme for government, the previous one, was a very high level document with aspirations more, so everyone should have a warm home. Yeah. Should a programme for government be like that, or should it actually direct a doing action? We will do this to get everybody a warm home. What should it look like?
I think particularly in the context of a very tight and difficult budget and the limited timescales, as you very well know, and it looks as though the most appropriate PFG would be a case of less is better, in the sense of having a small number of mission statements, whereas back in the 2010s, I remember one of the PFGs had something like 84 targets, or indicators plus targets. So you've got a limited number of very high level summary statements of what we're going to try and achieve, like reducing economic inactivity, raising economic productivity, reducing waiting lists, reducing carbon, and I'm not sure what the fifth one would be, but it's almost, and I know it's very cliched, but both Labour and Conservatives in London are going this way, the 5 mission statements on the back of a credit card sized piece of paper, because that's something people can understand and identify with.
I think we're at the point of it's like luxuries and necessities. So, and it totally links with your point that there are consequences now to the fact that we don't have the money to deliver on, better capital infrastructure or good services. So it's for the PFG to decide what are the necessities, and then that's a priority in terms of how that's set out.
Yeah, it completely changed the dynamic of this. But you cite that the lack of buy-in from the Health Minister is a problem. But whether a lesser party votes for the budget on the floor of the House is neither here nor there.
By lesser, do you mean smaller?
The smaller number, sorry, but so disrespectful. But the SDLP did it for years and it didn't have any effect. What's more important is that the Health Minister is responsible with his budget, no matter what the size and scale of that. Surely that's the issue, if he was to be irresponsible with that envelope.
Well, yes, and as I said earlier, the drawing reference to that was not saying that I would not assume that the Minister and his accounting officer will take the sum of money, inadequate as they may believe it is, and not work to that properly. They may make arguments in future in-year monitoring rounds that maybe the initial decision could be rethought, or that there's something to come out there. That's for them to decide. I think there's a general case for, in an ideal world, if you have everybody across the political spectrum pulling together and agreed on a thing, that's perhaps more likely to make it succeed, but it is by no means a guarantee that it would do. It would clearly be problematic if somebody said, I do not agree with this budget and I'm not going to stick to it, but it's my understanding that is not what the Health Minister has said.
Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Paul. So we've gone through most members there, so I just have a couple of points which kind of occurred to me as we were going through, and any other members have any final additional ones before we release the Fiscal Council today. Just on, we've covered the statutory basis point in the law. Philip asked, but I mean, is your position basically that it would be a good idea at some point, but we don't need it ASAP, or is that a product of the fact that you just don't know when the department's going to introduce a bill?
Yes, I mean, it's desirable to have that. That's best practice for fiscal watchdogs across the world.
All of the other ones on these islands, I think, are on a statutory footing. Is that? I mean, like obviously the OBR is.
Oh, that's right. And obviously the discussions that we've had with, and you will have had with the Department of Finance, there's obviously drawing on the legal bases for the other things. I'm now happily in the third year of my 6-month appointment, and I'm not running away because the legal I's and T's haven't been dotted and crossed. Respectively, it's desirable. It's better that you want the right one later rather than the wrong one quickly. So in that sense, you don't want to rush at it, but it is a desirable thing to have in place in the steady state. And obviously, it's for you and the Minister to decide when and how that happens.
You're all eligible for parole soon, but it's not really a decision for me to so just on behaviour.
Your reference to release had a certain penal quality to it. But
so I just had a broader question. So we've been talking a lot about the tightness of the position, and obviously being a devolved jurisdiction with a relatively minimal component of our funding coming from local revenue raising. We are, and we covered a bit of this last week with Gareth Hetherington from Ulster University, Dr. Burney's colleague. We are highly, obviously, or almost entirely dependent. I don't mean dependent in a judgmental sense, but the block grant is the dominant source of our revenue. Ergo, UK public spending writ large, which is connected to UK GDP, and obviously the UK GDP multiplied by political choices by the government of the day in terms of public spending. But would it be fair to say that, and here I'm going to draw, Sir Robert, on the organisation you helped set up, your previous employer, the OBR, around the long-run economic impact of Brexit, which is, I think the OBR's most recent EFO suggested, it's about, in terms of trade and goods, I think, or either trade overall or trade and goods is about 15% down in a long-run sense, which is a kind of 4% medium to long-term hit on GDP. So would it be fair to, assuming we agree with the OBR, now fairly established judgments that they've been making for really sort of 4 or 5 years now about the economic impact of Brexit, that were that economic activity, that extra 4% of UK GDP still there would be more money for public services in Northern Ireland? Is that a fair extrapolation? Obviously, a UK government might choose to still cut spending even if there's more GDP, but there would certainly be more economic trade intensity, therefore economic activity, therefore tax revenue. So there would theoretically be more based on the OBR's analysis.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to revisit my judgment on the impact of Brexit on the size of GDP, which I will duck. But no, I mean, clearly, if the UK economy is larger in real terms, that's likely to mean that you will have a greater amount of goods and services supplyable in both the private and the public sector, and there are choices to be made about how you divide that. I mean, as you pointed out, or as your opening remarks implied, there is the paradox that the performance of the Northern Ireland economy per se, while very important to the well-being of people in Northern Ireland, does not directly affect the amount of money that the executive has to spend, which is more dependent on the performance of the UK economy and what proportion of national GDP, of UK-wide GDP, the UK government wants to spend in the public sector rather than in the private sector, and whether it chooses to do that. There is, as we've discussed before, in terms of the way in which, once you have decided to increase public spending at the UK level, that feeds through to Northern Ireland. Prior to the 24% uplift, you had the paradox that the faster public spending grows in the UK, the faster the block grant grows in real terms, but the slower it grows in relative terms relative to the total for comparable spending per head in England. And there's a sort of legitimate question about, are you most concerned about how you're doing relative to England versus the amount of money you literally have available to you? And we pointed out you can interpret that in both of those ways. The fact that there is now agreement on the uplift means that is less of an issue because the Barnett squeeze has been effectively loosened.
Okay, thank you. That's a very fulsome answer. You're not telling me I'm wrong to say that it is I'm not being completely mad to infer that there would theoretically be more public spending in Northern Ireland that's subject to political choices that would be made by politicians were there not to have been a Brexit-related hit to productivity, and that is sort of on the record to the extent that we trust economic forecasters in the OBR. That I can make that statement without it being an unreasonable one.
And I would say that a larger UK economy will mean more money for both public and privately consumed goods and services, for whatever reason the UK economy were larger or smaller than otherwise. That's
very diplomatically put. I will just append to that the statement that the OBR says there's a 4% reduction in the potential productivity of the UK economy. But that is now your former employer, Sir Robert. So I don't know.
You're the appender. Yeah, that's absolutely appropriate.
Steve Aiken, who wants to come in briefly.
No, it was a very, very quick one, and it was actually the reference to put you on a statutory basis. I can't remember how many times we were told that it was just about to happen, and it was just about to happen. Are there any implications of you not being put on a statutory basis within this year?
Not particularly. I mean, we will carry on. I mean, we are being, well, it's self-evident. We are being funded adequately to produce what we are producing, and I hope that
there isn't a problem with the funding.
So we're not going to either be abolished or sunsetted in the absence of an agreement.
Okay. Are there, I think the Vice Chair wants to come in briefly.
I just wanted to apologise. I'm struggling to catch my breath a couple of times there, but apologies for stepping out. But thank you very much.
It wasn't a statement on the quality of the evidence.
Not at all. We're glad to see you back. That's the main thing.
Look, thank you very much for giving us both, first of all, for the quality of the analysis and also for giving us such detailed thoughts. Thank you very much for your time, Sir Robert, Dr. Burney, Maureen O'Reilly and Jonathan McAdams. We really appreciate your time, and we'll obviously be seeing you again soon. But it's most useful, and I think hopefully will also give us the opportunity to do some other MLAs. I'm sure we'll find all of this analysis and the evidence really useful when we come to debate the budget. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. The usual, one of the better ones. Thank you very much indeed.
Yes, we're going to now members.
Your comparative group.
Needs to step up. No, it is.
Now, members. Thank you very much. So we are. No, I'm going to do the matters arising, and then I'll step out last time. I'll step out. Okay. So members, we're now going to go back briefly to matters arising, and then we will move on to, just before we take our next evidence session, we're going to do the matters arising that we didn't get back to, that we didn't get through at the time. And we'll our other attempts. So we'll do these matters arising, and then we might take a very quick comfort break, and then we'll take evidence from. So we'll do matters arising, and then we'll do a quick break, and then we'll get our other evidence.
Just worried about our witnesses.
Okay.
They'll come back. They'll come back. They're only going to sit outside.
They're going to sit outside.
Okay.
I think they haven't been sent home. They know they haven't been sent home.
There hasn't let them go. She's there.
Okay, great. So we're just going to do matters arising, and then we're going to have just a very quick comfort break because it's quite a long evidence session, and then we're going to take evidence from Pivotal and Neri. Okay, so we did have to get through this because if members recall, we had some correspondence from last week's meeting that we didn't get a chance to get through. So at last week's meeting, no further agreement could be reached when quorum was lost. So there's some correspondence items we didn't consider. So members, these are page 17 of the pack. They are, in the interest of time, item 5.1. So if you look at what I might do is ask if members have any particular issues of interest, they can raise them under items 5.1 to 5.9. I won't go through them all in summary. So I would ask but if members have want to raise them, anything they can.
Jerry has texted in.
Jerry Carroll, did you wish to come in on a particular issue?
5.4.
You want to come in at 5.4, Jerry?
Yeah, Chair, is it okay now? Or
Go ahead now, yeah.
Yeah, thanks for noticing the chat there. Thanks for being here, Rose. Yeah, Chair, just obviously a report from the Chartered Institute of Housing on the future of the housing executive, and various options are outlined. And I think it's concerning, obviously, that I know the committee hasn't taken a position as such on this, but that privatisation is sort of outlined in various aspects as an option, varying from limited privatisation in terms of stock and full privatisation as well. So I'm just concerned that is obviously being touted, and I believe it was in the Communities Committee as well previously. So I don't know if we can write back to express our committee's view that we should maintain the housing executive as a public body, and obviously fight for it to be allowed to borrow and to ultimately build again. So that would be my general view on it, but I just want to highlight my concern that that privatisation argument is doing the rounds again, which is very, very concerning given the future model of the housing executive being discussed.
No problem, Jerry. Can I just suggest, rather than us write, can I suggest that you put your view on the record? I mean, I would largely agree with your view. At this stage, what I would suggest is that we ask to be kept abreast of this, and we can go back to that we've been forwarded this for our information. It is obviously, in scrutiny terms, is primarily for the Communities Committee. That's not to say that's not a vital subject. What I can ask is that we're kept abreast of future correspondence, so that members can be kept abreast of policy development in that area, so we can continue to put views on the record. But in terms of detailed scrutiny, it is for the Communities Committee at this point, if anybody else wants to come in. So from 5.1 if there are any other comments that people wish to make on any of those items from 5.1 to 5.9, I will briefly point out the Sports Sustainability Fund was a slightly interesting and questionable at times use of money during COVID, but it was obviously in extremely unusual circumstances. But that is again primarily for the Public Accounts Committee and communities. Okay, if members are content, then they have seen all the other items of correspondence that we went through, but didn't have a chance to go through in detail last week. Are people content that we?
Sorry, Chair, just one quick one. Are PAC still dealing with the sports fund thing?
The MOR has been issued and passed to the department.
Right.
So the question is, the question you're asking is whether the Public Accounts Committee is still dealing with the issue of the Sports Sustainability Fund. We can write to the PAC with the clerk and just ask what the position is.
I just wasn't sure where it was.
Indeed, yeah. And the £1.5 million that went to a very nice golf course, but okay. If members are content that all that correspondence has been noted. Great. Okay, then we will go to further correspondence, which is not from last week but new to us, which is starting with 5.10, which is that at the committee hearing on the 24th of April, members considered a response from the department with detailed analysis and narrative on NICS sickness absence data. This is provided for context at page 83 of your packs. If members wish to see that, it includes that extra data. The Department of Finance has now indicated the NISR statisticians are proposing to provide the committee with briefing and summary analysis to accompany all sickness statistical publications. Additional information has also been provided on how lost employee capacity is calculated, as well as the corrected figures for long-term sickness absence. If members are content to note this additional information provided, unless anybody has any comment on it. Okay, no, great. I should just say to our witnesses, it's important that we get through this because we'll do this, so we really appreciate the forbearance of our witnesses as we go through this. Item 5.11 is the Department of Finance outcome of financial context for revenue raising consultations. The department has provided a date for an oral briefing on the outcome of financial context for revenue raising consultations. It will take place on the 12th of June. By way of further update, members will be briefed on the consultation on non-domestic and domestic rating measures to support budget sustainability by raising additional revenue at the same meeting. I think it is possible that we will have more information about the broader fiscal picture and negotiations before then. So I would just reiterate, and indeed we have some indication that there will be progress on that in the coming days. But I would suggest that we ask the department to be kept abreast of this, including the clerk hopefully keep us abreast on any urgent developments, obviously via electronic communication. Unless anybody has any further comment they wish to make on that at this stage, we will have an evidence session, but I suspect we will have more information in advance of that. Okay. Item 5.12 and 5.15 is non-NICS outstanding pay claims. Members at the meeting on the 24th of April, when considering the WMS on the 2023 Civil Service Pay Award, members agreed to seek an update from the department on any outstanding pay claims, including where the department has including for those for non-NICS staff, non-Northern Ireland Civil Service staff, where the Department of Finance has a locus. At last week's meeting, members noted an update from the department in this request, and a response can be found at page 3 of your tabled pack. So this is to note, unless any members wish to make a comment at this point. No? Okay, so that's the page. Okay, we'll note it at this stage. And item 5.14 is the Hansard transcript from our DOF briefing on the executive budget that we've just been discussing with Fiscal Council, and we will discuss it in a second with other witnesses. So that was the oral hearing that we had a fortnight ago on the 1st of May. That transcript's at page 141. Can I ask members to note that transcript, unless they have any comments or any issues? Or okay. Great. Now we're going to go back to our to get more oral evidence, and we will ask Hansard to record this. Hansard are already here because they recorded the previous session. So at page 169, there was a clerk's memo on this evidence session. These are our third and fourth non-departmental briefings, having heard last week from Ulster University and this week from the Fiscal Council. We are now hearing from our very patient additional witnesses. Thank you very much. Anne Watt, who's the Director of Pivotal Think Tank, Paul McFlynn, who's the Co-Director of the Nevin Economic Research Institute, and Dr. Lisa Wilson, who is Senior Economist at Nevin too. Thank you, Anne, Paul and Lisa, for, first of all, for your patience in waiting, but hopefully the fact that you heard the previous evidence session will mean that you are able to, you're well ensconced and able to pick it up fairly quickly, though I'm sure you would be anyway. So obviously we're taking evidence on the 24-25 draft budget. We would ask those of you who wish to make an opening statement, that might not be any of you, but all three of you are more than entitled to make. Yeah, indeed, I suppose we have two different institutes. So Paul, if Lisa has anything to add, if you give us an opening statement, and then we'll go for Anne for one after that.
Okay, so thank you, Chair, and thanks to the committee for the invitation to speak. Look, you've heard a lot of evidence so far, but I mean, the first thing we want to say is obviously the context for Budget 2024 was extremely challenging. We acknowledge that, and it was known far before the statement was made. We welcome the fact that a budget was agreed by the Executive given existing spending pressures and the constraints of the overall fiscal statement. The biggest criticism we would make has been made the absence of a programme for government. For us, a programme for government sets out joint priorities and a direction of travel for Northern Ireland and is fundamental to ensuring the best use of resources and delivery of public services. Without this, it is hard to understand if the allocation of funds to various departments amounts to anything more than just the divvying up of monies. Such a process can result in ad hoc decision making, fragmented policy initiatives, and inefficient use of resources. Not setting strategic common goals means that there is absolutely no context to the decisions made about departmental allocations. These choices are seen as discrete decisions rather than necessary compromises within an overall limited budget settlement. One of the most significant elements of the budget was obviously the allocation to the Department of Health, which was less than the $1 billion sought by its minister. In the budgetary announcement, it was stated that it was not sustainable for health to keep eating up more and more of the budget year after year. This is true. It is clear that the current spending dynamic within the Department of Health cannot continue indefinitely. Had additional monies been made available to the Department of Health, it would have been at the expense of other public services that have already faced significant cuts. However, simply withholding those funds will not solve the problem either. There needs to be a plan to regain control of health spending, but that plan will not be successful if it remains limited to the confines of the Department of Health. The factors that contribute to the increase in health spending span the entire range of government departments. This is why a programme for government is so central. An executive-led, cross-departmental plan is needed to tackle not only the immediate spending pressures within the Department of Health, but also to put in place proactive measures to contain future demand, and this is crucial to fiscal sustainability. Commenting on the overall fiscal settlement of this year's budget, the UK government has now committed to setting a fiscal floor for Northern Ireland based on public spending needs, and the UK government make reference to work already undertaken by the Northern Ireland Fiscal Council in this direction, or in this regard. We want to say firstly that the definition of need employed in this discussion is an arbitrary formulation based on public spending decisions, local government spending decisions in England. It should not in any way be viewed as an objective assessment of the public spending needs of Northern Ireland. Secondly, there are issues with the UK government formulation and the further issues that poses for Northern Ireland's calculation of the floor. But beyond that, the most immediate concern is that the mechanism outlined by the UK government to achieve that fiscal floor is utterly inappropriate. The negotiations will continue between the Department of Finance and the UK Treasury. We believe the Executive will be most successful in that negotiation if it can set out how it plans to achieve longer term fiscal sustainability. But there needs to be an honest conversation about what that is. Before the executive returned, there was much made of revenue-raising capabilities within Northern Ireland. We see a danger in posing these as a solution to Northern Ireland's current public spending crisis. The UK government bears a significant responsibility for the constrained fiscal position that Northern Ireland finds itself in. Devolution is about empowering regions to enact policies tailored to local needs rather than simply being the handmaiden for national budgetary decisions. We believe that there is scope for increases in the regional rate, and while this budget was not the time to introduce significant and sharp increases in that regional rate, it is perhaps a missed opportunity that this budget was not used to signal that that was the direction of travel, and that such a signal may have been beneficial in further negotiations with the Treasury on the fiscal framework. It is worth remembering within that regional rates discussion that the objective should not be to align with revenue collected under the English council tax system. The English council tax system is highly regressive, and it's worth noting that the UK as a country raises a disproportionate amount of tax from property-based taxes compared to other countries which have a greater balance with regard to other taxes like income taxes. With just on the further fiscal devolution, we want to say as well, we recognise my colleague Lisa Wilson was part of the Fiscal Commission which looked at devolving income tax. There are significant short-term dangers within that, and seeing that as a solution to our public finances is equally dangerous. I think just overall, yes, we accept the context was extremely challenging and challenging time-wise as well. But a programme for government, without setting a programme for government, it means that next year's budget is going to be equally as challenging. There is an opportunity to achieve a more appropriate fiscal settlement from the UK government, but that endeavour requires a plan, and a programme for government should have been the beginning of that plan. Thank you.
Okay. Yep. Also give us, I think we'll have to take statements from both of you and then open it up to questions.
Thank you. So thank you to the committee for the invitation to be here this afternoon and to provide evidence. So I'm the director of the independent think tank Pivotal. My comments are in three themes here. So some headline comments and analysis about the budget figures and the allocations to departments. Some thoughts on how the process could be improved. And then some comments on Northern Ireland's financial settlement from the UK government. I've looked mostly here at resource DEL rather than capital or financial transactions capital, so that's kind of restricted my comments a little bit. So some headline thoughts really on the budget allocations. First of all, I think it's important to say it is really good and positive that the executive have agreed this budget. Obviously, noting that the health minister didn't agree and it's still to be debated in the Assembly. But this is a very challenging situation. It would have been easy to kick the can down the road, and actually it, I think, shows a business-like and constructive approach from the executive that they have agreed this in a very difficult context. It gives some certainty to departments and those funded by them at the start or near the start of the financial year. Clearly, there's no winners here. There's just varying degrees of losing, really, and we'll see how departments manage the funding they've got in the coming weeks as we see what that means for their programmes. As we've heard already, and I'll not go into this in too much detail, health is getting 51% of the budget, education is getting 19%, justice 8%, and so on through the departments. The funding split generally in the same kind of way as we would expect from what we've seen in the past. There is, I think, some kind of rebalancing towards education and justice. They have done least badly, if that's proper grammar, and that's maybe a deliberate attempt to partly reverse how poorly they have done in recent budgets in past years. So what does all this mean? Just 3 points of analysis. I think the first thing is something came out very clearly in the Fiscal Council's report yesterday, and you've already talked about it this afternoon, but there is no uplift at all in this budget from the outturn from last year. So the numbers in the written ministerial statement show a 926 million increase, but that's compared to the start of the year. And you've talked to Sir Robert and colleagues about that. But I think the implication of that is really concerning. There's no additional money to pay for anything this year. There's no additional money to pay for new pay settlements. There's money to pay for the things that were agreed in the past, but there's nothing new. It's basically flat in cash terms. That, I think, is very problematic. That overall 2% decrease, in fact, even though the headline number in the written ministerial statement is a 7% increase, it's actually a 2% decrease on the end of the year figure. So that means all departments, I think, apart from Justice, get an actual decrease compared to what they spent in 23-24, and Justice increase is tiny, 0.2%. So how are any new pay awards or other costs going to be funded this year? It even raises questions about how we're going to deliver the same services as last year. It certainly raises huge questions about any new spending. So you all know well that there's a lot of expectation on what the executive's going to do on childcare, waiting lists, special educational needs, the environment. There's nothing there in the budget to fund those new things unless existing spending or previous spending is cut. And the third thing I'd say is the past is catching up with us. We've had prolonged periods without government, 5 out of the last 7 years, and we're seeing problems from those times where we didn't have proper planning of public services. Even when the Executive and Assembly were in place, it was often unstable, and there was a failure to plan for longer term investment, workforce issues and public sector reform. And I'd echo Paul's point, we do need to face up to the challenge of ever increasing health spending. Doing nothing here isn't an option. We have to look at reform and going back to the recommendations in Bengoa and other reports. So what should the Executive do given this dire situation? This year I think has to be one of focusing on stabilisation and on preparation for next year. So I would suggest the Executive should be doing 3 things. They should choose priorities. So they should agree a small number of priority areas where they can make a difference. They should publish a plan about what they'll do and what we can expect to see in terms of improvements. And really importantly, they should prepare for next year, so prepare for a multi-year budget, for a proper programme for government and for public service transformation. Some comments then about how the process could improve. As has been said, and I'll not go into this too much because it's already been talked about a lot this afternoon, but we need to see what is the strategy underpinning this budget. How were the decisions made? Why were they made? Is it just dividing the money up in a way that's acceptable and reasonable between each department, or is there more of a plan behind it and a set of priorities? Perhaps that'll emerge in the budget documentation. It certainly wasn't in the written ministerial statement. So it is essential that we're working towards a meaningful programme for government that's genuinely cross-departmental and jointly owned. And that does have to be meaningful, not just everything. As discussed at the end of the last session, there's a risk that programme for governments are just aspirational. Less is better, I would say. So maybe it just needs to be quite a simple list of priorities. So we need a meaningful programme for government. We need to be working towards multi-year budgets to allow proper planning. And I think as well, there needs to be a commitment to improving outcomes and tracking their delivery. So the Executive should set out what they're doing, what they're spending on, how outcomes are going to improve, what the public can expect, and then report on that and be accountable for it. Some quick kind of process presentational issues. As I think it's probably clear from what I said, I find it completely unsatisfactory that the figures in the written ministerial statement were compared to the start of the year rather than the end of the year. I know that's the convention and I understand why, and there was a discussion about that in the last session, but I think at least we should have both and an explanation of that.
Are you talking about the presentation, or is it the presentation that bothers you most, Anne, or is it the substance of I mean, obviously you'd rather there was no there's more money, but it's the presentation you think is
I think the
disingenuous?
presentation of it is it isn't clear what's happening, to be honest. You know, I used to work in the Treasury and I'm looking at these numbers thinking, is this good news or bad news, you know? So I think it would be really helpful to, as the Fiscal Council have done in their report, they've put a big emphasis on comparing to the end of the year, the end year outturn, and showing that it's a 2% fall rather than a 7% rise. And I just feel it would have been clearer if the department had said that from the start in the written ministerial statement. So I think, I think the figures should be compared to the outturn, because that seems to me to be the meaningful comparison. You know, what did we actually spend last year? Also issues about, you know, we don't know what this means for departments yet. We have no detail about what actually is going to be spent or not spent. So we'll wait to see that from each department. And the timescales clearly are very constrained this year. We should have a proper public consultation and scrutiny process, and unfortunately we're not going to get that. Some final things just about then the UK financial settlement with Northern Ireland. I think it's I guess it's interesting and important that the Fiscal Council said in the report yesterday and this afternoon that if you say 124% is an appropriate level of need, that Northern Ireland is funded at that level this year, or indeed slightly over it. And now you can debate whether 124% is right. They've come up with 124% after several different reports and looking at different methodologies. So frequently we're saying Northern Ireland's underfunded, we're funded below need, but actually from their analysis, it seems to be saying we're actually slightly funded more than need this year. The big issue, of course, is if you say that's true for this year, next year, 26-27 is the massive problem, and that is a huge problem. There is a cliff edge, and perhaps 1 year earlier if the repayment of the overspends is brought into force. So 26-27 is extremely problematic, and that should be the focus for conversations with the UK government. I cannot see what the rationale for that kind of cliff edge in public finances is. And just on this, a very, very important point, which Paul mentioned, and I think came up at the end of the discussion with the Fiscal Council, whether the level of need is 124 or 123 or 127, the biggest determinant of public spending allocated to Northern Ireland is how much is allocated in England. It's the input at the start of the Barnett formula is the key thing, and I think that's often neglected in lots of debate about what's the right level of need. This is a relative system. It's not an absolute system. It gives an amount compared to what happens in England, and so if increases in England are low, as they have been in recent years, then what comes through to Northern Ireland is a lower amount. Similarly, if you get more allocated as an input into the Barnett formula, that's much more important than whether you're looking at 122, 124, 127. Finally, I'm going to stop now, but final end point is managing Northern Ireland's finances. It's a combination of issues. It's not just about pulling one lever and fixing it. It's not just about getting more money from the UK government. It's a combination of yes, the amount that comes through the Barnett formula, but also public sector efficiency, transformation in services, proper consideration to revenue raising, I would say, possible new powers to borrow or raise more revenue. It's not just one element, it's certainly not just one lever. All of those are important, and so it's good to see that all of those are, as far as I can see, in the mix in the conversations with the Treasury.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. That's really helpful, and obviously members do indicate, I think a good number of you have already, indicate should you wish to come in, and members who are joining us remotely indicate either via electronically or indeed put your camera on and put your hand up. But thank you, Paul, and indeed Lisa, and also Anne for that. I mean, if I could just go to, well, I'll bring all of you in on this, but one theme that I think is runs through your evidence is acknowledging that the input is too small, and I think there's a degree of consensus on that. Too small in the sense that certainly I would argue, and obviously I did in the previous evidence session, that UK public spending should be higher and possibly could be higher were certain policy decisions not made over the past decade and decade and a half. And also, there's clearly an argument that our level of need, accepting what Paul says, that need is just an academic official's term used for the relative public spending rather than any kind of objective analysis of what public spending we need. Accepting those conditions, we need better prioritisation to manage those constraints than probably we have in this statement. How, in that context, would or should the executive prioritise? So by that question, I mean in the Fiscal Council document on this, they asked 3 questions. Should we in NI raise more money for public services? If so, how? Where should we save money through better efficiencies? Do we need to reduce or completely stop delivering any services? Are there any particular ideas you guys would forward on any of those questions? I'll go to you first, Paul.
Yeah, I think the point, I think it's, you could come to any budget statement and say there should be greater public sector efficiencies. I think without pointing out what those are, I think given that we're not talking about a constrained public finances situation for the last year or two, we've been looking at a decade. There is no fat left to cut. And I think particularly when you saw the situation where we were in a year ago, where we were looking at, stopping providing public services, if there was some sort of efficiency available, it would have been taken. On the revenue raising, I think we really do over-egg this, and I think even the Fiscal Council were talking about some of their estimates. And I think if you look behind some of the estimates that are attached to some of these super parity measures, a change here or there can change the estimate of what we would raise significantly. And I think as well, even if we were able to amass a pile of revenue raising initiatives and charges, and were we able to implement all of them with the behavioural changes that would come from them, it might get us out of the hole for 1 year. And then we'd be looking at this again in the next year. We're dealing here with a trajectory of public spending, and we are running to stand still at the moment in order to be. The idea of fiscal sustainability is not objective either. It is what the UK government says it is. They determine the path of UK fiscal policy. And we could say that looking at what they've outlined for us in terms of spending plans, that we could make a plan to become fiscally sustainable. And then at the next UK fiscal event, they tighten that in the future years, as they have done with the current spending.
And with their own fiscal rules over many years.
Exactly. So the idea that Northern Ireland can constantly chase this elusive notion of fiscal sustainability when the goalposts are being constantly changed for us, I think it's not a real conversation. So I think there is within the last deal and the acceptance of the idea of a fiscal floor for Northern Ireland and the UK government accepting the fiscal need in Northern Ireland has already been breached. Yes, we're slightly above for this year because we're getting monies that were owed for previous years when we had fallen behind. Average it out over the years, we're going down below need, and we are going to be below need for another decade and a half if something isn't done. And I think it's worth pointing out that when we talk about, Nam mentioned the fiscal cliff that we face in 2025, 2026, it's not a coincidence that the shortfall that we face there equals what we would gain if we moved to 124 in terms of our fiscal settlement immediately, because one is a product of the other. If you consciously underfund a region like Northern Ireland, you will produce a deficit equal to the amount that you have underfunded it by. So the terms of the game have been set, and we're set up for a fall.
And I do disagree with very much of that, to be honest. One response to that would be, given we know that the Treasury is setting rules to its own advantage or to its own, based on its own biases. Obviously, there's the question about institutional instability and how that just bureaucratically makes all these things worse because decisions aren't made or they're delayed. So that makes public service is worse, whatever the quantum of spending. But doesn't that make an argument that within our current devolved setup, that you do want to, and obviously Lisa's here as a previous experience this from the Commission, that you do want to move towards something like more fiscal autonomy? If this is almost a broad philosophical, and I'll bring you back in, Anne, on the original question, almost a broader philosophical question. If we're kind of set up to fail within the confines of the current fiscal framework, obviously we can look to renegotiate the fiscal framework, but doesn't it argue strongly that we should be looking for more fiscal autonomy, which will inevitably mean more revenue raising, even if more fiscal autonomy?
I'll actually ask Lisa to comment on that point, because
I don't think actually the fiscal devolution is going to be the thing that is going to correct the state of your public finances.
Yeah.
To reach what you've suggested would mean that you're sure that when you achieve fiscal devolution, that the performance of the Northern Ireland economy is going to outpace that of the rest of the United Kingdom. The certainty of that is by no means likely, or I haven't been convinced of it to date. So I think to embark on fiscal devolution for that purpose of filling gaps or plugging holes kind of ticks more of the responsibility for fiscal sustainability than Northern Ireland needs to take. The fiscal sustainability of Northern Ireland is a UK-wide issue. I think what we have been poor at in the past is abdicating to the UK government their responsibility in ensuring the fiscal sustainability of Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland keeps being asked to publish a fiscal sustainability plan. What part the UK government plays in ensuring and assisting that fiscal sustainability hasn't been clear, and from all kind of indications that we have got, even the fiscal sustainability plan that is being written at the minute, there seems to be such a lack of clarity of what is being asked of the Department of Finance or of the Fiscal Council in publishing that, and the role that the UK government has in playing that I think needs to be queried.
We're sort of into the devolved politics and negotiations rather than economics, other than behavioural economics.
I would just add briefly to that. I think if you look to the experience of Scotland, what you ended up having is that the public spending envelope hasn't changed greatly. It is still determined by UK fiscal policy. They have just introduced a new wave of volatility within that already constrained package. So I think there is more scope for it, but and we've said this in the past as well, it would be better if the UK as a whole were to embark on greater fiscal devolution, if that's the plan for English regions, reform of metro mayors, and a system where the risk was spread between regions like that, then I think that is something that could be in the longer term beneficial to Northern Ireland. Sorry.
So Anne, over to you in the original question, which was really around prioritisation and how the executive accepting. Well, certainly my view is, and I got hints of that from yourselves, but I don't want to quote you, that there was perhaps not as much prioritisation as there could have been, accepting agreement that the quantum of funding is enough. How should they go about prioritisation?
I mean, I think it comes back to a programme for government again, which says this is what we think is important, and it does have to be a meaningful programme for government. So it should be, as has been said earlier, what are your priorities, and therefore what are you going to spend on? At the minute, I think it looks very much like the money was divided up in a way that was just acceptable to everyone, rather than saying this is what's particularly important. So I think it is about setting out priorities and then deciding where the money goes. I'm just on the issue of making efficiencies. I noted a few weeks ago Neil Gibson was here, I think, in front of your committee, and he said the kind of savings needed this year are not achievable through belt tightening. Ties in with what Paul said about we're on the back of 10 years of tight budgets. This has got to be about longer term transformation of public services, and that's not going to yield the financial rewards this year, but you've got to start. You've got to start doing that in a serious way, I think. So longer term transformation, there is that dedicated pot of money, there's the transformation board. We have to see that making a difference. And look, we've been in this situation so many times, saying that transformation's a priority, and it hasn't happened to the extent that it needs to.
Would it be right to say then that accepting, well, not accepting, but acknowledging for the time being the limitations of the devolved spending settlement and how it works, that is the view that a better way of securing concessions or at least putting pressure on the Treasury to agree a more not beneficial but a more reasonable medium-term fiscal framework for Northern Ireland is by saying you, on your own terms and in your own language, asked for a sustainability plan. Here's our sustainability plan, which says that these are our priorities over the course of the rest of this mandate. These are the choices we're willing to make. Some of them are difficult, but these are the choices we're willing to make because these are the priorities. You now need to match our choices. Is that what you're saying? That within the confines that basically the executive has to show that it's willing to make choices, even if it doesn't theoretically accept the confines that are being placed on it. It has to make those choices and then say, now you hold up your end of the bargain.
I actually think the Treasury would be more impressed by a longer term look at Northern Ireland's public finances, because I think any kind of trajectory on our current spending levels via departments, we're not going anywhere good, and we're going there very, very fast. I think if there is an ability to take a longer term frame of what are the public spending pressures that we're going to face, what can we do within and between departments in order to transform services, but also to, in many cases, to make earlier interventions to contain demands that just end up in the system. That's the key, and I think that is something the Treasury can get behind, because over the longer term it is the only thing that is going to make a difference. I think you can say it's a hard decision and we cut a service now, but what are the outturns, what are the unintended consequences of that in years to come? And can you actually say that when you remove a vital public service, that you are not going to create problems which cost you money further down the road anyway? I think as well, people expect a range of public services here equivalent to what is provided in the UK as a whole. That is part of the bargain, and I think without that it undermines the legitimacy of devolution itself.
Okay. I'm going to open up to colleagues now. The Deputy Chair, Dan Forsyth.
No, I'm okay, thank you.
You're okay?
Sore throat.
Okay, no problem. Dan's got sore throat. Paul through.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for your presentations. Paul, you used striking language when we talked about the fiscal devolution of income tax. Most would say it would be ineffective. Most would say it won't make a big difference. But you actually used the word danger. You talked about it presents short-term dangers. Can you elaborate for me on that, please? What do you actually mean? Can you put the meat in the bones?
That we would face a funding shortfall. So obviously, if we have income tax devolved to Northern Ireland, what we calculate as the sum of that will be subtracted from our block grant. Now, there may be schemes put in place for a safety net, as there have been before, but they're not there to entirely recover the danger. But the danger would be that we would have this amount of money reduced from our block grant, and we would be counting on a forecast that we would get that amount in coming to the Northern Ireland Executive in terms of revenue. But what the block grant is calculated on is how the UK economy grows over that time period in order to calculate what the block grant would be. If Northern Ireland's economy, as it can, and regional economies, all UK regional economies are in different trajectories, were to grow at a slower pace over that, we would face an immediate fiscal shortfall. And it is a problem with trying to attach fiscal devolution to a system of government that isn't actually fully devolved. The UK government's a big country. Any other country of comparable size has federal structures. Yeah. There are state, regional, national taxes, and there are horizontal fiscal equalisation going on between all of them. There is a whole system available to those regions. We don't have any of that, and we would be flying blind to take that on immediately. It is good for the longer term to make a region more responsive to what's happening in the local economy by having its revenue and its spending determined by that. It makes you more responsible for your actions, and that is a laudable aim in the longer term. The public finances situation we find ourselves in at the moment, I don't think we can afford to take the risk.
So is it just the fact that there's a danger of stagnation in your economy, which means you don't draw in as much money? Is it also true that you would actually de-socialise your pot? At the minute, it's a UK-wide socialised pot. If you were to differentiate in any shape or form in the context of Northern Ireland, would that mean then that Northern Ireland would basically have to socialise its own pot?
Yes, to a certain extent, you are assuming a responsibility which was previously the responsibility of the UK government. 100%.
Which could even work out greater than the hit on the block grant, basically.
It would like, I mean, I would say that's the short term. The short term hit is to the block grant. Yes, you would be sort of breaching a sort of a principle in terms of how Northern Ireland public spending is determined. But I mean, Scotland has done the same thing, and it is, still a part of the UK. And as I say, its overall public spending is still determined by UK fiscal policy. They just have that short-term volatility introduced.
I want to Scotland because I either read it or somebody told me over the past number of days that Scotland has basically raised their income tax by 1p in order to pay for the hit on the block grant, if I'm right in saying that? Or can you explain that to me better?
No, that they didn't do. It wasn't done with the intention to do that, but they have not gained as much as they would have those who were forecasting from increasing it. There has been a fallback.
Although there's significant behavioural effects that have accrued to Scotland, which we might not expect to occur here, the migratory impact in Scotland to England is likely to be greater than from Northern Ireland.
You mean people moving from Scotland across the border just because of an income tax price?
Yeah, and the evidence so far on that is limited, but it would still be more likely in that situation than in our own.
Basically, there's nothing but diminish the tax base, basically.
That would diminish the tax base in Northern Ireland, yeah. And it's
surely there should be there would have to be big movements to actually see that on the radar.
It would depend actually, because if you look at the income statistics, the HMRC and the income statistics, there are some quite high earners within Northern Ireland, and they do stand out. If they were to leave, it would have a not immaterial impact on Northern Ireland's tax take.
Of course, any devolution of power down here also is dependent on the right decisions being taken by local ministers, and then the results of that being positive.
Yes.
So there's multi-layered dangers everywhere we look.
That is a political danger, so I'll leave that to Anne. Yeah.
Can I actually add to that, though, in terms of the local dangers of doing it, but also the UK dangers of their decisions in terms of their policy changes, the income tax, and the impact that has on Northern Ireland's fiscal position. It's something that really goes on talked about whenever the personal tax allowance was increased to 12,500. The knock-on effect that this has had on the revenue per head raised in Northern Ireland. When that was raised, so many people was brought out of having to pay income tax in Northern Ireland. You can look at the trends and the impact that has had on the fiscal position of Northern Ireland in terms of the widening fiscal gap over time is substantial. And that's the impact of the UK government policy impact on Northern Ireland. It's something obviously we don't have control over.
Yeah. Fascinating. Thank you.
Yep. Okay, that's the person.
Add one more thing on that.
Yes, go ahead.
On this point. Sorry, it's not about income tax. It's about revenue raising generally. I know this isn't a popular topic, and I completely accept Paul's point that you're talking about small amounts in a lot of cases. I do think we should be having a fuller conversation about this. We should be saying, if we want to fund childcare more fully, where are we getting the money from? Are we cutting existing services? Are we doing efficiencies, transformation? The money has to come from somewhere. One of the places it could come from is revenue raising, and I would say there are some people who could pay more in household charges. Household charges, as discussed in the last session, are between £500 and £800 less per year in Northern Ireland compared to Scotland and Wales and England. That is an absolutely legitimate political decision, but you can't do that and say we don't have the money that we would have raised from it as well. You can't have your cake and eat it. So I think we should be having a fuller conversation about whether we should be raising more revenue at least to look at the numbers, look at all the consequences and reject it, but
surely,
not just reject it.
But surely
reject it out of
disposable
hand.
income has to have a massive part in that formula, as wage structure also.
Can I think if I'm sort of paraphrasing, the point you're kind of making is one that I agree with, is that if you're trying to have a conversation about policy interventions, then there's a difference between revenue raising will solve all our problems and that will get us to where the Treasury thinks they have decided we should be, versus let's think about specific policy interventions and where we could locally raise the revenue to do it. I think that is a legitimate conversation, albeit I would say, just because I'm here and I say it all the time, we do have one particular bit of devolved, and as someone who believes in general in greater devolution of revenue, I think we are spending £2.5 million a year.
What's that?
On non-existent long-haul flights.
Yeah, that way you never mentioned it before.
It's not very much, but it does exist, and unfortunately I think it undermines fiscal devolution, which I think is a bad thing. Steve Aiken.
Yeah, okay, thanks very much indeed. Thanks very much indeed, and thanks everybody for your sort of briefing so far. Look, first one, I've had all the briefings we've had today, there's one word I haven't heard, it's growth.
Yeah.
And the one thing we need to do is develop the circumstances where we can generate growth. And the conventional wisdom would be we do that by investing in higher education, we sort out our infrastructure, and we do something about corporation tax or some sort of piece to do with that as well. What's your collective perspective on growth? We keep on talking about the downside, but what are we trying to do to fix it?
I should say you don't have to have a collective perspective, you're allowed to have different opinions, that's what I would do.
I think you had a good conversation last week with Gareth Hetherington about this, and he came here to talk about the budget, but actually it was really, I thought it was very powerful, because he basically said this is about economic growth, and he said it's about growth.
If you don't do growth, we're going nowhere.
It's about public sector reform. So I would say three things about growth, and I think you've already said two of them. The first thing about growth is stability. Stability in government, not just stable government, but also knowing what government's going to do. So businesses want to know what the government's plan is about investment in schools, the health service, infrastructure. They want to know that those things are going to be there and they can trust that they'll be there, that they can rely on them. So whether that's Indigenous firms or inward investment, so they want stability in government. So very important factor here, as we know. Second two things, you've said them already, very obviously, skills and infrastructure, both extremely important, particularly our lower levels of adult skills. Far too many adults with no or very low qualifications, and not enough at the other end with STEM degrees and higher level degrees. We must address that via back to Fair Start, actually, early intervention with disadvantaged children. I note that is, I don't think, well, we'll see what comes out from the budget, but I don't think that is funded at the moment. The funding that was in place disappeared last year, I think. So when we're talking about childcare, we need to be thinking about the most disadvantaged, particularly, I think, and trying to narrow the gap. So yes, skills and infrastructure, and we know well, and I'm sure as a committee you've talked lots of times about the water and wastewater infrastructure and how that's constraining development. So that would be my priorities there.
I think my priority would be, and I think it would be a great thing for the Programme for Government, to actually do an analysis of economic policy making in Northern Ireland over the last 2 decades. Because what we're doing so far clearly isn't working. When we look at the productivity stats, something has got to change. I thought the report on Invest Northern Ireland was excellent, because it started a conversation about saying, yes, there may have been a time when this mode of supports and the type of investments that we made were key to improving growth. The game has changed. I have to say the game has changed on corporation tax, and when you talk, certainly in the Republic, about what they see as the future for that, they know they're running out the clock on that policy. Actually, they're flabbergasted they've lasted as long as they have, particularly in terms of the revenue generation that's come from it, but already appears to be levelling off. But I think we have to be more honest about the fact that we have failed in terms of economic policy over the last number of years. And we talk about making decisions about government spending. programme for government should be about things that we were doing before and that we're not going to do anymore because they're clearly not having the desired impact in the economy. But I think looking at our productivity performance, getting as much, and sorry, we need more data on that. That's a point. The last productivity figures we have for Northern Ireland are from 2019. We're talking about this being a central pillar of the executive's economic policy, and we're once again flying blind. We have no idea how that has shifted, considering the sort of cataclysm we had in between now and then. So an honest appraisal of the failures we've had in economic policy, and then we start building from there. But I mean, all the other things we talked about, infrastructure, absolutely. But there's something, we put a lot of money into economic development in Northern Ireland. We do not get bang for buck at all, and we need to ask questions about that.
I would say that I began in the NI around 2016. The very first thing that I had to do, and when I started, was respond to the draft programme for government, which was that outcomes-based thing. That was never agreed. There has never been an agreed programme for government, so that's an issue. But the long-run thing that has ran through previous programmes for government is economic growth and the reduction of poverty and social exclusion. Two worthy targets, and still as worthy today as they have ran through. But we haven't been able to get to the point where we're putting into action those things. I do think, what should go into a programme for government. The 4 pillars outlined in the Department for Economy's vision are very clear things that could fit within, a short list of focus points of a programme for government. And added to, though, I don't think you should end there. Your point about, having more warm homes, that is about reducing fuel poverty. Fuel poverty kills people. So I think, we should, not be so, flippant necessarily about the importance of those things. Those outcomes that were previously in programmes for government, you couldn't really disagree with many of them. What was missing was delivering on it, action, and linking it then to the budget.
Who's actually responsible for it? Yep.
So I did a presentation at a Fiscal Council conference last autumn, and the title was, "Does Public Spending Support Economic Growth?" Right? And I'm sure it was fabulous, my presentation. It was certainly 10 or 15 minutes of it. The answer was, we don't know, because but we've never had that sort of theme going through public spending decisions. So I think this is an interesting example of why we need a programme for government. If you said growth is our number one priority, then you'd be saying, okay, what does that mean for the health budget, the education budget, the infrastructure budget, and so on? But we don't do that.
And so my second question, which is probably, thank you for the high level thing, and I'm glad you came up with all those answers. Slightly the different one is and you put your finger on it. Here we are putting a budget. And as I said to Sir Robert, who was being rather diplomatic about it, we agreed a very large voting account of 65%, which basically give us more time because we thought we'd be faffing around about actually creating a programme for government and a consultation process and the rest of it. Yet here we are rushing ahead with the budget. There's no PFG, there's no priorities, there's no consultation, and everything just seems to be stovepiped. And what they've done is they've salami sliced it at 2% less than what was last time. Some have won more, some have won less. That's not a good baseline to go forward on, is it?
No, I would fairly obviously.
In fact, just leave it that.
That's it, we'll just leave it there. I think, yes, you're right. There's been, this has been raised by several MLAs in recent days. The period when there was no government, there were all those conversations going on, and I thought
they were there. Some of us sat there.
I don't know. I wasn't part of any of that, but I thought that the executive returning would be in a much better position to suddenly move forward quite quickly on the programme for government.
Sorry, declaration of interest. Sorry, I sat in most of those conversations, and what was agreed then has absolutely no bearing on what we're doing now.
That kind of explains it a bit, I suppose. I think there's a risk here that we're going to get a programme for government that is long, detailed, includes everything, and you couldn't disagree with any of it. Lots of worthy outcomes, lots of important things, but I think we'll get something which is not a priority list. And actually, I would say if the executive wished, they could sit down at their next meeting and write down the top 5 or 6 things. And there you go. There's your programme for government for the short term at least. And that would be a serious prioritisation exercise. It'd be difficult to do it, but a real focus on what can be done. Maybe that's what you need, rather than putting everything in a way that then doesn't become that meaningful.
I would think, just very briefly, I think there is still time to do a programme for government, and I don't think you can set it out in a longer term, but I think you can retroactively look at the budget decisions that have been made, explain them as part of a longer term strategy, and say this is a holding document, we will be coming back to this again and again and adding to it. But I think to be able to come up with an entire programme for government to tie it into a fiscal sustainability plan now, I think it would be a rush job, but I think at least point people in the direction of where this is going. I think that can be done. It would have been ideal to have it done beforehand, but it's not too late.
Assembly, all the executive parties agreed in SDLP motions are calling for just that the other day, so I presume we're going to get it fairly soon. Now, Philip Brett, who's giving me a very charming grin, having a little intervention.
As always, Mr. Chairman, thank you. And good to see you again. Paul, I think I was on television with you last night, though you were a pre-record screen. And Dr. Wilson, congratulations on your recent appointment by the Minister, and good luck in defining that long elusive term of a good job. We look forward to hearing that in another place. Paul, just firstly for you, if you don't mind, sir, you said that there was scope for increase in the regional rate. Could you maybe go into a bit more detail on that?
I think, and we had the discussion earlier about, and I'm very keen to say that it should not be, and it has been cast as comparing ourselves with households in England, Scotland and Wales. And I think that the danger of doing that is that we are looking at one tax in isolation. Yes, it's undeniable we pay less in money terms than households in other UK regions. That doesn't necessarily mean we pay less tax. We pay, and Lisa's run the figures recently enough, based on the data, and it's sometimes choppy, we pay as much, if not more, in tax as a share of our total output, our GVA, than they do in England. We pay more VAT than other regions. So to come to us and say you should pay more, you should pay this amount in household charges because they do, and we don't go around to households in England and say you need to pay more VAT to even yourself up with what they pay in Northern Ireland. So yes, there is scope to broaden, and I think there is progressivity measures within the existing system that can be enacted, and I think we can show maybe a direction of travel where we want to get to. But I think some of the figures that have been talked about, whether it's on water charges or an increase in rates to match water charge bills in other regions, is a level of increase for households which is just not simply, people will not be in a position to pay it. So we may be able to calculate it and be able to put it in nice fancy tables, but it is not a realistic proposition for household budgets.
I get that, but maybe I'm quoting you wrong. You did say there was a scope for increase?
There is scope to increase, and I think we did increase this year, but I think what we could have done was say that we are going to increase by X percentage next year and the year after and the year after to reach a certain point. I think that allows household finances to plan for those increases. I think these are best when they are given in as much advance as possible, but I don't think doing it all at once was ever a realistic proposition.
And I'm going to disagree with you if you don't mind. So your view was that it's better to compare the outturn from last year for departments to the opening budget of this year. That's not what Sir Robert said, and I know you'd probably prepare. So his view was that you.
Back at my notes.
Yeah. So what his view was that you have to compare time and time. So his preferred option would be you compare the closing of last year and then the closing.
My impression of what Sir Robert said was he did not say what you're saying, but he also said he could see the perspective of someone on the public service delivery end of things, but he could also, as an ex-Treasury person, could see the kind of year to end to year thing. So I think that would be a fair depiction, but I'm not contradicting you.
Yep. So his view was you can't compare two different time periods. I'm just wondering, having him said that, does your view change, or do you still think it's better to?
I think it would have been good to have both in the written ministerial statement, because I think the numbers that came out the end of April on the Thursday afternoon, just glancing at them, it looked like this is great news. A 7% increase, 950 million increase compared to last year. Sounded like this, we're not going to be in as much trouble. Yeah. I think the reality is the amount that was spent by the Department of Education, Infrastructure, Health, whoever it is, the amount that was spent last year on pay and pay awards and everything else that they fund, that is what they needed to spend last year. There would be an expectation that they would need to spend a similar amount this year, plus some more for inflation and for new pay awards. So comparing to something which at the start of the year was actually an inadequate allocation is, I think, a little bit misleading is probably too strong a word. I think what I would say is it would have been really good to have both sets of figures, and in the Fiscal Council's report they do report both sets of figures, comparing to the budget at the start of the year, comparing to the likely outturn, and that's what I would have liked to have seen from the department.
That's not the usual way in which,
no.
I'm only new to this, but this is the way budgets have always been.
It's usually compared to the start of the year, because there's I suppose there's a sense that additional allocations in year can distort the figures in some way. But I think, particularly in our current situation where we've been topped up so much, and that has been essential really to keep public services running, and particularly to make pay awards, to then strip all that out is a little bit misleading.
Okay. Your view is that there are people in Northern Ireland who can, maybe I don't want to quote you wrong, who can afford to pay more in rates. Is that was your?
I think there are people in Northern Ireland, and maybe some of them, maybe it's some of us in this room, I think, who have reasonably comfortable lifestyles
Just wondering
and
if you
could afford to pay more.
Identify those people. So, in your view, what are you basing that on? Property value? Are you basing that on current income? What do you base? How would you?
I think if it was rates, it would be based on property value, but I would say it's a combination of both those things. I think there's a sizable number of people in Northern Ireland with very comfortable, or indeed extremely comfortable lifestyles, and they could afford to pay some more. And if we believe in a progressive system, then maybe we should be looking to those people more. The problem is there's not very many of them comparatively, so the amount of money that it would raise is relatively small.
Just trying to work out who in your view are those people.
Well, you'd have to look and look at incomes data and look at property price data. But I think the one thing which has been on the table, and I think still is on the table, is the cap on higher value property rates. Mm-hmm. So that will be an obvious first place to go. And that's not going to be popular. But look, I would always say we look to those people who are more able to absorb that cost than to people on lower incomes.
That is all that I have, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, next is Nicola Brogan, who is coming in remotely. Nicola.
Thank you, Chair. And again, thanks very much to all of you for your presentation there. It's really actually interesting stuff and good useful information. Anne and Paul, you both discussed the cliff edge that we'll be facing in 2026-27. Whenever the financial package runs out, essentially, and their kind of top up. Obviously, that's very concerning for all of us. But can you give me an idea of just how severe a crisis that'll be, and how concerned you are really about this cliff edge?
I mean, I think I'm concerned about this year and next year as well as 26-27, just because the allocation is basically flat compared to last year as it turned out at the end of the year. So I think we've already got serious problems, and we can see that from the numbers that have come through from the allocations to departments. But the situation in 26-27 is a drop off of something of the order of about 500 million, and that's just, you know, that cannot be absorbed, and I don't think that's sustainable at all from the Treasury's point of view. That's you can't plan public finances on that basis, and I think the Fiscal Council's previous report said exactly that point. How can you justify that? So I think that has to be rectified.
Yeah, I mean, I think the discussion with Treasury on fiscal floor has to be before we hit that fiscal cliff edge. And I think, you know, no one is explicitly saying it, but I think looking at that, it's not a realistic proposition. So I would think we would have to get to some sort of a agreement before then.
And in that case then, Paul, would it be, in your opinion, a case that the executive needs to go and have these negotiations with Treasury, or can they implement anything themselves at the minute to try and alleviate those pressures?
No, the scale of 500, as Anne said there is, you'd be talking about a whole-scale withdrawal of certain public services. That's what we'd be talking about here, and I don't think that is in any way feasible or desirable for anybody involved who has agency in that particular discussion.
Okay, thank you for that.
The UK government's obviously chosen to top Northern Ireland up to around about 124-125% this year, last year and next year. So why is it then saying there's a big drop and then you converge up to 124% by the mid-2030s? Doesn't make sense to me.
Doesn't make sense. No, not me. Thank you for that, Anne. And I just also want to come in on what you mentioned. You made it very, very clear before that you think that, like, about the importance of transformation of public services in order to bring finances under control, and executive parties appear to have agreed. So in your view, what pace and scale of transformation must be taken to avoid any future crises within the budget for transformation?
Yeah, I'm not sure I can answer that question. I mean, I'd be looking to getting in external expertise on this, you know, and I know this transformation board is being set up or will be set up, and I think we've got to get really good people on that from, you know, local people, but also people from outside who have done this kind of process, and you know, set in place something that's very ambitious but also deliverable. But I don't think, I'm not in a position to answer your question, I don't think, in any detail.
There are transformation agendas already that were begun. Particularly, there was a beginnings of a plan in health from the outgoings of Bengoa that never got off the ground, but it's ready to go. So there are things that can be started, and we would best concentrate on starting them now.
The works that are right in place. Okay. And just finally, Lisa, you talked about how people in the north pay more tax as a percentage on their income than those in Great Britain. Can you give me a bit more information on that and your analysis of it? And I suppose, do you think this should be part of negotiations with Treasury as well about the impact this has then on budgetary pressures here?
I think what you're referring to is when we estimate the percentage of tax as a ratio of GDP, Northern Ireland isn't out of step with the rest of the UK, as in we don't pay less tax as a whole. It really depends, though, on the year of data that you use, whether or not slightly below or slightly beneath. There is, you know, severe revisions to both the GDP data that happens, but also the country and regional public finances data that makes it difficult to have some certainty on both of those. But I think, you know, the consistency of the trend is one where we don't think that as a whole Northern Ireland pays less tax compared.
Okay. Okay, listen, thanks very much to the three of you there, and thank you, Chair.
Okay, Jerry Carroll, those coming in remotely.
No, Jerry.
There he is. No, Jerry. Oh, sound.
Jerry.
Yep. No.
Yeah, okay now.
Yes.
Yep.
I'll go again. It was really good. I'll do it again. There was some really good points being raised by everybody, and I like the myth busting stuff as well, and kind of challenging that idea. You know, the hated term that I are as often battling with, the begging bowl analogy, that people here obviously are paying just as much, if not more than, in some cases, people in Britain. So that was helpful and useful. Thanks for that. And the suggestion that English council tax comparison is not a good one for us to use in terms of revenue raising and other measures here was useful as well. And just a final comment is the suggestion or my sort of takeaway from, I think, Paul's comments, that fiscal stability is not a neutral term. It's obviously designed by this Tory government and one which is very right wing and anti-public services. But just two points. Ask your view on it. I mean, is there an element of hypocrisy at play? This government is, I think, 2.5 trillion last time I checked in debt, and it's dictating the ministers and politicians in the assembly here that they can't, that they need to raise revenue and they can't live beyond their means as they would suggest it. There's an element of hypocrisy at play, that it's one rule for the British government and another for devolved administrations in terms of that.
I would tend to agree, and I think I would go back to the point: fiscal sustainability is not a neutral term, and I think we're having the goalposts changed on us constantly, and I don't think that allows us longer term thinking and more responsible government.
I think that if Northern Ireland wants to get a better fiscal settlement from the UK government, it does need to demonstrate that it's taken some of the steps to manage its own budget. I think that's important, whether that's revenue raising or transformation in public services or efficiency savings. Those things hopefully potentially yield some more revenue to spend on other things. But it's also very important to indicate to the UK government that Northern Ireland is taking this on itself and being responsible itself, and that, I hope, would mean more flexibility from the UK government in those conversations.
Thanks. And just a final question from me is, I think it was Lisa or somebody alluded to sort of the impact on humans and individuals in terms of decisions around public spending, and quite often it is just numbers and data, and humans are kind of, I'm not saying from anybody presenting today, but humans are often sort of neglected or not emphasised or talked about enough. Any views on an anti-poverty strategy, something that was being promised for many a year, and we were kind of promised that it would be an urgent priority for an incoming executive. Any views on what that could do in terms of, if it was implemented and money allocated to one, the sort of impact on reducing inequality and those kind of issues across our sector? That would be of interest. Thanks.
I think one of the most frustrating things about the anti-poverty strategy is how long we've been talking about an anti-poverty strategy, and I think the last we had heard about it was that there's plans even to scrap the most recent kind of experts report that was done, which is a very frustrating place obviously to be, because the scrapping of that is just purely because the executive has collapsed, and now we've come with a new set of decisions were made in the past that was produced, and now we've decided no, we want to do things differently. I don't think the substance of the detail which was in that anti-poverty strategy plan, which was then to go to the co-design process, should materially change. But I do think that long-run focus on reducing poverty and social exclusion that has ran through Northern Ireland Executive Programme for Governments has been a really worthy goal of government. And when we talk about issues about super parity and measures in relation to how we do things differently, our policy choices, some of the most significant things that Northern Ireland politicians has decided to do has been to reduce the the impact of policies which would have a detrimental impact to the most poor and most vulnerable in Northern Ireland, about welfare mitigation and things like that. And so I think, just to say, that we shouldn't, we need to stop doing things like that, because our public finances are calling, and there's difficult choices to be made. I think that goal of supporting people in poverty and doing as much as we can is a worthy goal and should be continued.
Just one thing that I hope will be helpful on this front is the Joseph Rowntree Foundation have just said they're going to set up a team in Northern Ireland, which they haven't done before. So that will give, I think, the weight and the status and the connections of that organisation on issues of poverty and destitution, which I think will be very welcome.
Thank you.
Okay, that is most useful. I think at this stage, unless colleagues have any further questions, we will release Paul and Lisa. That was extremely useful evidence and very wide-ranging and clear. So thank you all very much. We will hopefully be hearing from you again during the course of the rest of this mandate. And thank you very much for all your work in terms of the broader policy debate as well as today. So thank you.
Thank you.
So, members, we're now going to turn, and thank you to Hansard for that.
Yes, we're just going to pick that one.
So, members, we now have correspondence, which is this week's correspondence rather than last week's. We are just about quorate, so hopefully we can get through as much of it as possible. So I'll draw your attention to these one by one, and then you'll have an opportunity to comment. Item 9.1 is a reply from the Department of Finance to the Economy Committee, which about the non-domestic RHI tariff and an associated business case. That correspondence is at page 173 of your pack. A number of questions are answered by the department. They update on the business case that has been submitted on the non-domestic RHI tariff, but they are waiting next steps. And then there's a couple of other questions that are asked. So if members are content to note at this point, or would any member like to say, Paul Frew?
Just to reinforce the fact that the court says that the department must set a fair and reasonable tariff. So we wait to see with bated breath.
Sorry,
maybe going to make the same point. Sorry, Steve.
I think Diane wanted to come in. I think Diane first. I got Diane first, and then I'll bring you and Steve after that. Okay.
Sorry, no, it was whenever this point was raised by Steve Egan previously. I think we were looking for, even if it was in restricted correspondence, an estimate of maybe a ballpark figure. Here was where the query had come from.
So I think, tell me if this is wrong, I think this is separate.
Okay.
This is because this isn't fraud. This is directly to us.
This is correspondence that is a response to the Economy Committee. We have our own separate correspondence in which covers the issues which we
So we will probably get our own bespoke response, which will cover, and I think they cover disciplinary matters as well.
Yes.
Steve, did you want to come in? Or was it the same?
Yeah, no, it was on that issue. It's just that I've had a response from the Minister to a topical question I raised that had come back and indicates clearly that they're planning a new renewable scheme to replace the one that they had. But there was no indication of costs, which is what the question would be. And again, I think it's a legitimate question for us to keep on asking, what's the cost and where do they lie?
Indeed. Well, as I say, hopefully we'll have at least some of that information whenever our response, and if we need more, we'll go back. Okay, so content to note that reply, which is out with the our own response. The next item is the 12th report of the examiner of statutory rules, which is at page 177 of the meeting pack. There are no relevant rules relevant to us, so just to note at this point. 9.3 is correspondence from the Exchequer Secretary to the Treasury to Lord J, who is the chair of the who is chair of the European Affairs Subcommittee in the Lords on the Windsor Framework, and this correspondence regarding to the EU Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism and potential application in Northern Ireland. And really, there isn't very much detail in that. So members, that's to note at this stage. I'm happy to bring people in for comments, and we obviously will be copied into any future correspondence and developments on this. Does anyone come in?
Yes, just a quick one. Could you just forward that on to our committee, or sorry, the Windsor Framework Democratic Scrutiny Committee, because that hasn't come to us yet.
No.
If they haven't, yes, I think that would be a good
committee. Also the
EAR committee. Yeah, we should copy. That's a good point. We should copy those in. Yeah.
And it also goes to, I think it also goes to infrastructure as well. Bizarrely,
I think they're on the CC list. We'll check back.
Yeah,
and possibly also the economy committee, because it has an energy.
Well.
So basically, everybody.
It goes into a lot of areas where you wouldn't have thought. Okay.
So, item 9.4, Financial Committee of the Synod, which is the inquiry into fiscal intergovernmental relations. Now, this is not about the broader issues that we've been talking about. It is about the it's correspondence that we've been copied into from the Welsh, our counterparts in Cardiff Bay, Welsh Finance Committee, to the Finance Minister here, Kiva Archibald, seeking information on an alleged dispute between the NI Executive and HM Treasury in 2022. So this is just a note for us, but I think it will be useful to see the response.
We'll get the response copied back to the department. Will do that.
I think this will be a useful response to us. Item 9.5 is also from our friends in Wales. It is page 88 of the meeting pack. We've been copied into correspondence from the Clerk of the Senate to the Clerk of the Northern Ireland Assembly regarding 2 legislative consent motions on the Victims and Prisoners Bill, which have been debated by the Senate. So this is to note, unless anybody has any comments.
Why do we get those?
So, Chair, we get all of these. All the committees are copied in. What we want to do is make sure that nobody slips through the net.
All right,
so
okay.
we will flag them every time.
Because I was reading that and it wasn't.
No, it's not relevant. But we also want members to have a clear awareness of the quantum of what's coming through, just in case you're not seeing it in another committee.
Okay. Item 9.6 is the Construction Employers Federation, their submission on the draft budget 24-25, which we have just been discussing. So we wrote to a range of selected relevant stakeholders to get their views. CEF has provided a response, and it will form part of our report on the draft executive budget 24-25. If any member wants to read any particular issue, they are welcome to, but obviously they can. It'll be part of the committee report, and obviously members and their parties are able to use that information for to develop their own responses to the budget. People are content to note at this point. Okay, so that's all the correspondence. Agenda item 10 is the draft forward work programme, which is at page 199 of the meeting pack, and there are some recent updates through the clerk.
Yes, Chair, that this now can largely be ignored because we've learned some new things today and yesterday. So members will be aware now that the vote on budget debate has been put into the business diary for the 28th. For the Minister to lay a paper in advance of that, there is a certain number of days in advance of the debate that has to be laid to allow for amendments. So we understand that paper will be laid on Tuesday the 21st of May, which is next Tuesday. So what I'm asking members to agree to is some reshuffling of next week, so that we can invite Joanne McBurney and her colleagues to come up and brief on this paper. So what that would essentially mean, if members are agreeable, is dropping the forecast outturn out of next week and putting a bit of a time pressure on the DOF only briefing, DOF only budget briefing. We still would have NICFA. We would still need to get through our report to be agreed in advance of the vote on the budget. But last week the members agreed to start at 1 p.m. So we should be okay as long as we drop that outturn briefing and invite Joanne and colleagues up to talk about the paper once it's laid. I think they'd probably be expecting that. So that's the change for next week I wanted to get members to agree to. Also, in terms of agreeing our budget report, members, we'd flagged up previously, it's not a traditional report that we might have done in the past when we had more time. This is going to be a collection of evidence with a reasonably short covering narrative. It will cover what we've heard so far, but we'll also have to ask members to agree in advance for certain papers from Hansard to go in. So next week's NICFA briefing, we won't have the Hansard on that before we go to publication. So we'll need to seek members' advance agreement to add that as an addendum. In terms of the stakeholder inputs, a number of the stakeholders, probably half of those we've gone out to, have flagged up already. They will respond. Those responses are due tomorrow. Okay. With other committee responses, those might not be that fulsome, due on Friday. I think that the issue for other stat committees has been getting briefings organised in a timescale. So that will largely become the issue then that those committees reflect on in the debate. But we'll get what they can give us, any Hansards, etc. that they have. So we'll bring that as a collection next week, and we'll go through that probably in fairly short order.
It's also worth saying, I'll bring it down in a second, it's also worth saying, without putting too fine a point on it, because it's information that is partial, but should we hypothetically find out more money, Freudian slip, find out more information about developments between the UK government and the finance department in the coming days, that will need to be factored into the evidence sessions that we take now. It just so happens that it's obviously part of the budget process, so we won't necessarily have to call additional people, but we will want to keep on top of that.
We should do more in the next day.
And we should do more in the next day, but it will be important. Yes, I think Diane wanted to come in on that.
I just had a couple of things. In terms of the written briefing on the restatement of the 23-24 outturn, I'm happy for that to be in writing, but will we be able to get it far enough in advance that we can still take it to have questions along with next week's meeting? So I'm presuming there's nothing too substantial in it, but hopefully any written briefing would have a brief explanation as to why anything has moved, so that if we have any concern of it and say we get our papers the previous Friday, we can ask Joanne about that whenever she's briefing us on the rest. Because I do feel like it forms part of that.
Because they've modified the way they present it from feedback from members before, so we should be okay with that. Although, bearing in mind we've now dropped out the briefing so that we can accommodate everything else next week, so we'll need to reschedule that briefing. But the written briefing you're talking about should be fine. I'm not going to create it because I've now confused myself.
It's just you've got in here restatement March 23-24 outturn,
that's now dropped. Forgive me, that is now dropped.
So
what's that to accommodate Joanne next week with the statement that's being laid? We hope next Tuesday. That's the one we'll drop out. However, handily enough, it's the same officials. So she might
you can ask them questions.
Be able to
so it would just be nice to
we
see
still
it
have the written briefing.
with it flagged if anything's substantial.
What we do is we get the written briefing, but we just not have the briefing itself. So sorry, I get exactly what you mean.
No, I done just two other points.
Flag it up.
In terms of these next 2 weeks and just the speedy pace at which we're moving through things, we've made a comment, Paul Free had raised it last week as well, in terms of other committees and their feedback on the briefings that they've got. I think that, so I know obviously we've asked them for that, but I would be very keen to make sure that we collate and are able to feed that into our committee's comments come any debate on the 28th as well. And on to the second point, I wonder, should we suggest having a finance committee meeting early on Tuesday the 28th morning before business opens? Given how our last meeting's the 22nd, we'll have our briefing and we'll be waiting for other committees to feed back to us.
Got the bank holiday
can I suggest, I think that's not a bad idea, so can I suggest the clerk goes away and finds it and communicates to us either via email or electronic, or WhatsApp about potentially, but can I also, because I am aware that, anecdotally, that some committees do not have their budget scrutiny hearings until June, which is an absurd position. So I think we need to. I think that if it's able, you lot on, and Clary and the whole team have a lot on. But to get from committees, even if we're, because in some of these cases we are not going to be able to. Our report is not going to contain any detailed scrutiny from those other committees. So we will need. I think that's correct, isn't it?
No, that is Chair.
We will need.
Very few have had.
It'll be helpful to know up front, and hopefully we'll know it by next week anyway. Which
we should have briefing. We should have anything they're returning to us on Friday. So the date for due from stakeholders is tomorrow. The date from other stat committees is Friday to allow us to collate for next Wednesday. But I think where we're probably looking to go is ultimately going out to them again once they've actually had these briefings, because they're not going to get to that stage before this debate, which is
the point that I'm making is that at this point it would be useful, like we talked in the formation of this committee, the legacy report of the last one, how we can improve the budget process. So if we are able to in the chamber on the 28th say, look, this is real mixed feedback. This is going to come back to us again in June. We would encourage, a better process. So
I think that makes sense.
Chair, even though we have a deadline of Friday and that these committees won't have conducted their scrutiny and had their presentations, I think that we still want something returned, even just to say that, and even the explanation as to why they haven't received it yet, whether it was the department pushing it back or whether it was a schedule or a work programme not allowing it,
or the committee themselves deciding that this isn't as much. Okay,
we have asked for that, and I've reinforced that with the clerks when I've met them as a group as well. So I'm hopeful. We are just still just on quorum.
Just a quorum.
So yeah, we will do as much as we can to make sure we get it done. But I think absolutely the feedback we're getting is they've not had time to scrutinise.
Okay, people happy enough with that? We so on one point, and sort of we have to do one, but I just want to raise one other point on the forward work programme, and I'll do it. I could do it on any business, but I think, and we've discussed this already. We discussed this I think last week, but I think it's even more urgent now, given some of the what's emerged from COVID inquiry that we hear from the head of civil service on record keeping in particular, but civil service reform before the summer recess.
That's requests already in the
So,
a couple of days ago.
Yeah.
So I think we very, very much need that before, and it was slightly disappointing, I'm sort of putting on the record, when I asked a question about this, it was put to me that I asked a broad question about related issues, and the point about being sub judice was raised with me, which I think I find spurious in the extreme. And the more it's occurred to me since that session, I just think the more it bothers me to think that the question of sub judice proceeding, given something clearly of such broad public interest and is being reported so widely, was thrown up. I think it's important that we have that. So I'm just putting that on the record. But thanks.
I agree.
Pleased to hear that others are in agreement and that our very efficient support team with limited resources are already on it. So that's the draft forward work programme. Now we just have one final SL1 to get through before. Yes.
I've got a piece of AOB up that I would like.
You have AOB. We'll go back to AOB right at the end, Steve. Agenda item 6 is the SL1 on Government Resources and Accounts Northern Ireland Act 2001 Designation of Bodies Order 2024. Members, on the 10th of May, the Department of Finance wrote to the committee in relation to a proposed statutory rule, which is the Government Resource and Accounts Northern Ireland Act 2001 Estimates and Accounts Designation of Bodies Order. This is Granny, as it's known for the inducted. The proposed statutory rule is a technical proposal providing a list of designated bodies for inclusion in departmental estimates and accounts for year ending 31st of March 25. The rule is subject to negative resolution procedure before the Assembly. A clerk's cover note, relevant correspondence and full details of the proposed rule can be found at page 160 of the meeting pack. Members, are you content with the policy proposal for statutory rule providing a list of designated bodies for inclusion in departmental estimates and accounts? Or does anybody want to make any comments? Content?
Can I ask, do they have to do this every year? Do they have to do this stat rule every year?
Yes, even if there's no changes.
Yeah, because it's simply because there are changes.
All right, okay.
It's not identical every year, but
And if there's no changes.
I remember this coming through
they have
before,
to
but
be
yeah, I
through.
think
It's the way the original legislation's been set up. It has to be done annually, whether there's changes or not. But occasionally you get a change. Makes it interesting.
in case there are new bodies that are created either on
Or
steady
some
state.
disappear.
Okay, so if we're content, then we'll move on to NEOB and any other business. Stevie, can you wish to?
Yeah, just a quick one. I was reading this excellent report done by the Fiscal Council, and I noted, I think, on page 17, it was a statement that the new executive plans to drop the October round due to resourcing constraint, largely technical in nature of the monitoring round. I was a bit surprised to discover that there was a proposal to drop the October monitoring round and it hadn't been communicated to this committee. And that is not standard in practice. And the sort of 3 monitoring rounds are there for very good reasons. And it seems a bit strange to me that that had been communicated to the Fiscal Council and hadn't been communicated to the committee. It may have been an oversight. There may be some particular reason to do it, but I think this committee should have been informed of that as the change, and actually the reasons for dropping a monitoring round should be made very clear to us.
think that's a good point.
Yeah, and sorry, go on, Dan.
Well, I think I'll bring the Vice Chair and I'll bring yourself
No,
up.
absolutely, go on, Dan.
No, sorry, and as well, given the circumstances that we are in now, that we're going to be bringing a budget pre-summer recess with the June monitoring rounds hitting it, actually the October one's incredibly important this year.
My point exactly. The October one should be the most effective one because it gives you it's given you time to work out that you haven't needed the money, you've given it back, and it's given our department time to spend the money. So it should be more effective. The October one should be more effective than the January one. So I don't understand why. You can understand them coming saying we're going to drop the June monitoring round, but not the October one. It just doesn't make sense to me.
Yes, I think I think so. I think it's important that we will contact the department and ask for a urgent clarification.
We have an informal query in already, and I'd spoken to the Fiscal Council, who obviously had flagged it up in their report, so that they don't necessarily have a full rationale for it. So I think their thought was it was not happening this year, but it was happening from next year. But what we'll do is we can put it through to the department officially now that the committee has discussed it.
Okay. Thank you very much for raising that. If there's any other business? No, in that case we'll move to date, time and place of the next meeting. The next committee meeting is scheduled for Wednesday the 22nd of May, again in this room and again at the earlier time of 1 p.m. So if everyone's happy enough to
can we reach out to Leslie about making sure we've got some form of link to Central Ena?
We will make sure you put all the links you need, and we will do our very best on that one.
Okay. Of course we will have some Napoleonic
hard on quorum.
We'll get tricorn hats each.
Well, was it Napoleon?
Or no, it was a buy.
There's lots of Napoleon. I think we should adjourn before I have any more Napoleonic quotes.
Committee Room 21. Sound.